Chapter 765. The late autumn rain gradually grew heavier. Wuxia walked out of the alley in the rain, under the strange gazes of the passers-by, and came to a small fork in the road beside the Tianhe River. The wet rainwater flowed down his clothes and slowly dripped down the black cloth on his face. He stopped here and then raised his head slightly, looking at the distant imperial palace in the misty rain. Yesterday afternoon, Wuxia had also spent half a day looking at the royal palace. Although he came from the temple and had unconsciously followed Fan Xian to see the world of mortals, the royal palace was indeed the most worthwhile place to visit in the capital. It was the most magnificent building, but Wuxia had come here 2 days in a row. Presumably, some other opportunity had influenced his decision. Under the eaves on the side of the street, a few urchins in cotton-padded jackets were carrying square school bags. They rubbed their hands against the cold, their faces pale from the cold. Every day these children went to the public school set up by the court to study, and they all carried umbrellas with them. But when they reached the mouth of the alley, the rain suddenly grew heavier. "Look, it's that idiot from yesterday." One of the children thought that the rain was too boring. Although it seemed that they could delay class, who would want to bow their head under someone else's roof. At that moment he discovered Wuxia standing woodenly in the rain like an idiot. He recognized him as the idiot who had allowed himself to be abused by him the day before, and was as happy as if he had discovered a new continent. There were no stones under the eaves and the urchins rolled their eyes. Next to a coal stove, they found some bits of coal that had not completely burned out the night before. With shrill laughter and yelling they began to throw them at Wuxia. For some reason, it seemed that when humans were very young, they were very good at bullying people weaker than themselves to prove their strength, and thus obtain some sort of spiritual satisfaction. This seemed to be a kind of innate nature. Otherwise, why would the children feel joy when they heard the bits of coal falling on Wuxia's body? Why would they feel joy when they saw Wuxia's body smashed and dirty? There were not many people hiding from the rain on the streets. In the eyes of these few Jingdo commoners, the blind man standing in the rain in a daze was clearly an idiot and a handicapped person. They couldn't help but feel some sympathy, but when they saw the stains on the blind man's body, they unconsciously felt some disgust. Therefore, other than a woman who looked like an auntie, who fiercely scolded those little brats, no one else did anything. They just watched indifferently as those disapproving children used their own methods to vent their violent desires that were inherent in all life. With a smack, a lump of coal soaked in water ruthlessly smashed into Wuxia's motionless and expressionless face. It made a crisp sound as if he had been slapped in the face. That piece of coal knocked the black cloth off Wuxia's face a little. Wuxia's pale face also tilted a little, as if he did not quite understand what had happened. Then, he straightened the black cloth on his face and slowly turned around to look at the children under the eaves whose hands were not clean. The urchins were not afraid because they had smashed him all afternoon yesterday, and this blind idiot showed no signs of resistance. On the contrary, seeing that Wuxia had reacted today, they felt even more excited. The bits of coal that were smashed into the rain in the street suddenly became denser. Smack, smack, smack. Finally someone found a stone. Mixed with the coal, they smashed it into Wuxia's head and face, leaving behind dirty marks and a few streaks of blood. Washed by the rain, they flowed on Wuxia's pale face like a flood after a dry season, carrying thousands of years of trash. On the face of the earth they washed out frightening marks. Wuxia still did not dodge. Wuxia still did not dodge. It turned out that Wuxia could also be injured. Separated by the black cloth, he stared in a daze at the children who were laughing incessantly and waving their little hands. He did not understand why they wanted to attack him. He also did not understand why the innocent faces of these children could have such savage smiles. He also did not understand why the stones, regardless of whether they were sharp or round, smashed into his head or face. His heart felt somewhat strange. What kind of emotion was that? Sadness? Disappointment? Anger? Dissatisfaction? Or was it just emotion? Wuxia looked at the children and allowed them to smash him. Suddenly, in his muddled mind, there seemed to be something extra. The rain suddenly became heavy. It was as if someone had cut a large hole in the late autumn sky of the capital. Countless rivers, lakes, and seas poured down from that unfathomably deep hole, turning into a torrential downpour that filled the sky and scattered over the streets and on top of the homes. It was as if a large hole had suddenly opened in Wuxia's mind. Clear and unrestrained sunlight shone down, enveloping his entire body in a strange emotion. He had emotions. What did this prove? Was it the same as what the young man called Fan Xian said about curiosity? Wuxia began to think again. He thought silently in the boundless rain. The young man called Fan Xian had once said many things to him, but he did not understand. He could not understand. He could only remember it in his heart. What did the young man called Fan Xian do? It seemed that he went to the royal palace. It seemed to be for revenge. Why revenge? For whom? It seemed that someone had died. That was why the person called Fan Xian was dissatisfied and unhappy. It was a woman called Yi Qingmei and an old cripple called Qin Pingping. These two unfamiliar names seemed to become clearer and more familiar in Wu Zhu's mind, along with the rain that filled the sky and the clear light that shone through the large hole. However, what gave him a headache was that he still could not remember who they were. Had he not been in the temple his entire life? Wu Zhu still couldn't remember anything, but he had something he shouldn't have had, and that was emotions. In fact, since yesterday afternoon, those emotions had already filled his heart, causing his eyes to only be separated by a black cloth as he quietly looked at the imperial palace. This emotion was called disgust. For some reason Wu Zhu could not explain it. He loathed the tallest building in Jingdo. Perhaps it was because he instinctively loathed the people inside the building? When he left the snowy temple, the young man called Fan Xian coughed up blood and told him to follow his heart. But what was the heart? Was it the fresh and unfamiliar emotion he was feeling right now? Wu Zhu decided to go to the royal palace to have a look and find the true source of his emotions. He wanted to see if there was anyone inside he wanted to see, someone he was fated to see. Thus, he placed his hand steadily on the metal drill by his waist. At the same time, he lowered his head slightly and put on the bamboo hat on his back again. He blocked the rain from the sky and covered his eyes with the black cloth. However, the children were still happily throwing stones and cold debris. After a moment of silence, Wu Zhu let go of the iron drill in his hand and squatted down. His palm moved through the flowing sewage on the ground and grabbed a handful of cold debris that was not hard. He could not harm humans unless it was for the benefit of humanity as a whole. The biggest difference between Wu Zhu and the old man in the temple was that he did not understand what the benefit of humanity as a whole was and what it had to do with him. Perhaps those young humans were only playing a game. Wu Zhu thought so and reacted in this way. At least, he did not feel any disgust or anger toward these young humans who bullied and humiliated him. Since it was a game, he would play a game with them once. Perhaps they would stop bothering him like this. Wu Zhu directly threw the coal mixed with rainwater toward the children under the eaves by the side of the street. A wave of terrified cries, a wave of panicked footsteps, countless cries, and the sound of someone fainting in the rain fell to the ground. A mess of sounds followed Wu Zhu's actions. A handful of coal briquettes mixed with dirty water accurately split into 4 portions and accurately hit the bodies of the urchins. One of the urchins who laughed the loudest had his head smashed and blood oozed out. He fainted in the rain without making a sound. After a deathly silence, an angry roar suddenly exploded. An idiot killed someone. The previously cold and detached Jingdo commoners suddenly became outstanding citizens who were eager for justice. They reported to the officials and their parents. There were even some middle-aged men who took out wooden sticks and mops and prepared to beat the idiot to the ground. They were all neighbors. Naturally, they could not just watch as the children suffered so much. The mother of the child who had fainted on the ground threw herself on top of the child, crying loudly and cursing Wu Zhu with hatred. Wu Zhu watched all of this coldly. He still did not understand. If this was a game, why was the woman crying? If this was not a game, why did they not stop the children earlier? He knew that he would not be hurt. Did these humans also know that he was not normal? Did they not worry about his safety when the children beat him earlier? In the rain, the silent Wu Zhu vaguely learned a few things. He understood a little that human emotions had nothing to do with choice or reason. It turned out that it was divided by affection and disgust. In this world, Wu Zhu believed that the person closest to him should be that young man called Fan Xian. He hated the royal palace the most, so he no longer paid attention to these people who seemed to have gone mad. Very seriously, he smoothed out the wrinkles on the black cloth on his face again. Placing his hand on the metal drill at his waist, he stepped toward the royal palace in the distance. Someone tried to kill this idiot, blind, crazy person, and then fainted on the ground. The wooden stick also broke in two. In the heavy rain, Wu Zhu, dressed in cotton clothes and wearing a straw hat, easily walked out of the angry crowd of Jingdo people, leaving behind only a ground of people crying out in pain. Wu Zhu did not kill anyone. It was not that he did not dare to, but it was a habit he had developed over hundreds of thousands of years. He did not kill when he did not want to, but when he wanted to, he would. When the bailiffs of the capital government arrived at the fork of the river, the madman who had beaten the people had long disappeared. Looking at the people crying out in pain in the rain, the leader of the bailiffs took a quick look and sucked in a breath of cold air. He wondered who this master was, to be able to act so cleanly and efficiently. How could a master disdain to make life difficult for these defenseless people? The leader of the bailiffs felt a chill, not because of the people's injuries, but because of the blind man who had disappeared. If, as the people said, that person was an idiot, then, without question, this idiot must be the most powerful martial madman in history. Having such a martial madman running around in the capital, the leader of the bailiffs was afraid. He immediately had his subordinates notify the yamen of the capital government, and then nervously asked the person next to him, "Where did that madman go?" "I think he went in the direction of the square," the person replied with a trembling voice. He gritted his teeth and said, "That person has been watching the palace for 2 days. I'm afraid there's something wrong." The leader of the bailiffs did not need to ask again to know that this person wanted to kill the madman. If anything involved the palace, there was no way out. But hearing that the martial madman was heading straight in the direction of the palace, the leader of the bailiffs felt a bit more relaxed. After all, there were many masters in the palace and the imperial guards were strict. Even the most powerful martial madman could only be beaten to the ground. Even if the legendary Sir Fan came back, could he break into the palace? The rain continued to fall. Wuxia did not know how urgently the people on the street behind him wanted him dead. He also did not know that the leader of the bailiffs had already sentenced him to death. He only wore a straw hat and held a metal drill. Step by step, he walked toward the square of the palace with unusual stability and straightforwardness. In Langia County in northern Qi, the new cloth shoes Fan Xian had bought for him had long been soaked in the water. With each step, it was like a drum sounded in Wuxia's mind, pounding against his heart and soul. Yi Qingmei, Chen Pingping, Fan Xian, these names that seemed far away but were also close rang out endlessly in his mind. With each step, he faintly remembered something. Although it was not clear, it was particularly close. For example, this royal palace in the cold rain, this Jingdo filled with a familiar smell, and it was filled with glass he had made. It was so familiar. At the same time as he approached the square of the imperial city, Wuxia's disgust for the imperial palace deepened. This majestic imperial city that stood in the storm was so unshakable, so strict and disgusting. Jingdo was an old place and the royal palace was also an old place, Wuxia thought. Walking alone in the rain in an old place, he had to run into a road blocked by rain. The road was quiet and lonely, and he was too lazy to avoid it in the rain. What blocked Wuxia's path was people, not the rain. It was a group of imperial soldiers in full armor and full of murderous intent. The rain fell on the gray armor of these elite soldiers of the Qing military, making pitter-patter sounds. It fell on their solemn faces, but it did not stir up the slightest change in their emotions. The expression on Wuxia's face did not change in the slightest. His body continued to lean forward, allowing the bamboo hat on his head to block out the pouring rain. His feet did not slow down, nor did he speed up. He only steadily walked at a speed he was accustomed to toward the center of the plaza. Wuxia wanted to enter the royal palace to have a look, so he had to pass through the main gate of the royal palace and walk through the square in the rain. For him, this was unusually simple logic. He did not care at all whether or not someone would stop him. For the imperial soldiers responsible for the safety of the royal palace, his unusually simple logic appeared unusually cold and daring. The news of Fan Xian's return to the capital had already spread from the Yi Manor last night. Now all of the upper echelons of the Qing kingdom knew of this shocking news. The royal palace had been under martial law since last night. Everything that entered was checked very strictly. The defense had also been raised to an unprecedented level of tension. Even on the day the Jingdo garrison had escorted the old director of the Overwatch Council back to the capital, the security in the royal palace had not been as tight as it was today. Everyone knew why Fan Xian had returned to the capital. He would certainly try to enter the palace again to assassinate the emperor. The Qing court would not give this rebel a second chance. The imperial army's patrol work extended out by 1/3 of the area. There was a heavy rain this morning. The wet and cold feeling made everyone raise their guard. They also felt waves of fear. They didn't know where Fan Xian was or when he would kill his way into the palace. The small disturbance at the fork in the Tianhe road had also fallen into the eyes of the imperial army. However, the soldiers responsible for the safety of the outer perimeter did not see the sudden incident of a martial madman as too important. However, when this blind martial madman wearing a conical hat suddenly displayed astonishing strength and began to silently walk toward the imperial palace, the imperial guards finally realized that something was amiss. When the cloth shoe on the blind man's right foot stepped onto the puddles of water on the stone slabs of the square, the imperial army gave their first warning. They began to gather their military power and prepare to capture him in one move. However, it was as if Wu Zhu did not hear the warning that was enough to chill the hearts of most people in the world. He continued to walk steadily and silently. Under the wary gaze of the Imperial Army on the palace walls and the cold and stern gaze of the Imperial Army soldiers in the square, he walked steadily step by step. After 3 warnings, the blind man in the heavy rain still acted as if he did not hear them and turned a blind eye to them. Step by step, he walked toward the center of the square toward the front gate of the royal palace. Even at this moment, the soldiers of the Imperial Army still believed that this strange person was a lunatic and did not associate him with an assassin. In the eyes of the common people, no matter how powerful an assassin, even Sigu Jian of the past, would not choose such an open and honorable method of assassination. Surrounded by tens of thousands of Imperial Army soldiers, under the towering walls of the royal palace, no one would be able to break through the obstruction of so many people, kill their way into the royal palace, and point their sword at the emperor. Unless there really was a god in this world. Thus, the Imperial Army thought this strange blind man was perhaps a madman with extremely bad luck. In such a tense situation, to suddenly charge into the forbidden area in front of the royal palace, what awaited him could only be death. Wu Zhu continued to walk as if he did not see the row of Imperial Army soldiers blocking him in front of him. At this time the wind and rain that filled the sky were still wreaking havoc. The endless rain was like a huge wave on the East Sea, about to swallow up his lonely figure. In the end, it was unable to swallow him because he walked out of the rain. Kill. An Imperial Army officer narrowed his eyes slightly. He felt a bone-piercing chill coming from the body of the blind man not far away. The blind man had already walked into the forbidden area. Furthermore, a sense of danger made the officer give the order without any hesitation. With a swoosh, the Imperial Army soldiers blocking in front of Wu Zhu drew their swords in unison. In an instant, the light of the swords lit up the rainy sky in front of the royal palace. There was no loud swishing of swords. Wu Zhu only steadily pulled out the metal drill at his waist and then stabbed out. His speed did not appear fast in the ruthless wind and rain. Furthermore, the way he stabbed out with the drill was not particularly exquisite. However, each time the metal drill was thrust out, the tip of the drill would accurately pierce the throat of an Imperial Army soldier. Accurate, clean, and stable. This was the feeling Wu Zhu felt when he attacked. It was very simple, but when it reached the extreme, it became a certain realm. From the time the officer said the word kill, to when Wu Zhu killed all the Imperial Army soldiers in front of him, only a few breaths had passed. In the sky full of rain, the ground behind Wu Zhu was littered with bodies. Fresh blood had just surged out from the throats of the bodies when it was washed away by the rain. In the process of killing, Wu Zhu's speed did not change at all. His 2 feet advancing in the rain remained steady as if he had not encountered any hindrance. He moved through the rain and killed as he went. This was not the ease of a peerless ace. It did not give the Imperial Army soldiers around the royal palace the feeling of a powerful warrior taking a leisurely stroll. They only felt cold, very cold. The blind man's attacks were steady to the point of incomparable coldness. The Imperial soldiers didn't even know how their colleagues had died to that metal drill. This was because the blind man in the bamboo hat didn't exude an aura that could pierce through the heavens and earth, and his attacks weren't particularly crafty or vicious. However, the metal drill seemed to be covered in a layer of heavenly coldness. In the rain, it easily calculated all the angles and possibilities. Then it chose the most reasonable crack in space and passed it out. It seemed to be simple, yet it was actually capable of shaking the heavens and the earth, and it was sufficient to cause everyone who witnessed this scene to completely lose all confidence in going against him. The officer watched helplessly as his subordinates died at the hands of the blind man wearing the straw hat without even making a sound. He felt a chill throughout his body, colder than the autumn rain that fell incessantly around him. Wu Zhu walked in front of him. The officer suddenly felt that the other party's clothes, which had been soaked by the rain and had turned dark, were not ordinary clothes. The metal drill in the other party's hand was also not an ordinary weapon. The other party was not a person, but a monster that condensed all the mysteries between heaven and earth and breathed in all the coldness between heaven and earth. The officer's entire body trembled. He bravely pulled out his knife. Then he saw the metal drill pierce into his chin. It was then pulled back like a flash of lightning. Too fast. Why did it seem so slow earlier? Why couldn't he dodge it no matter what? The officer fell heavily into the rain with these questions in his mind. His eyes filled with fear were gradually drowned by the water. Then he saw a pair of soaked cloth shoes walk past his head. At this moment, the feet wearing the cloth shoes were still as steady as ever. The rain continued to fall and the Imperial soldiers continued to die. The fear of the unknown brought about by the god of killing in the bamboo hat made the imperial soldiers responsible for the safety of the royal palace extremely angry and courageous. Wave after wave they charged forward to kill. However, these imperial army soldiers were unable to stop Wu Zhu's steady footsteps in the slightest. Wu Zhu lowered his head, turned around and bent his knees. With a calmness and calculation that completely exceeded the imagination of mortals, he calmly moved aside all the weapons that could harm his body. Then he thrust out the metal drill and tore apart the curtain of autumn rain in front of him. He tore apart the layers of encirclement in front of him. He only wanted to enter the royal palace to take a look. Because of this, people continuously fell by his side. Blood continuously dyed the curtain of rain red. People continuously died and fell into the rain. There were incessant cries of alarm, miserable screams and muffled grunts. He was like an emissary of heaven who had fallen into the dust for some unknown reason. Using the calmest and most terrifying method, he was harvesting the guards by the emperor's side and harvesting the lives of the common and lowly. The people in front of Wu Zhu grew fewer and fewer, but the corpses on the ground grew more and more. Suddenly Wu Zhu stopped in the middle of the square in front of the royal palace. There was no longer a single person standing by his side. Around him, hundreds of imperial army soldiers lay in pools of blood. No matter how violent the autumn rain was, it could not wash away the blood in an instant. He slowly raised his head and looked above the royal palace. The imperial army on the palace walls had long drawn their bows and knocked their arrows. The densely packed arrows were already aimed at Wu Zhu in front of the palace gates. At any moment, tens of thousands of arrows could be fired. Wu Zhu stood in the blood and raised his head. Separated by the black cloth, he looked at the familiar yet strange royal palace and the terrifying arrows. His face that was exposed outside the cloth was still calm. There was no fear at all. He only slowly raised his right arm and extended the metal drill in his hand into the torrential rain, allowing the rain to wash away the bloodstains on it. The rain struck the metal drill with a pitter-patter. The imperial army, who had been struck out of their wits by the metal drill, had been ordered back into the palace gates. At this moment, the vermilion palace gates were tightly shut. Other than the bloody corpses lying on the ground, there was only the stormy sea of wind and rain and the blind man wearing the straw hat standing alone. Countless people on the royal palace saw this scene and felt a chill from the depths of their hearts. Who exactly was this unimaginably powerful blind man? The pale-faced commander of the imperial army, Gong Dian, stood on the palace walls and watched the blind man standing alone in the rain. His body trembled slightly. He thought of the woman and her young servant many years ago. An unprecedented fear welled up in the depths of his heart. He knew who the other party was. At the first moment, he had already notified the emperor in the palace. However, he had no idea whether or not his tens of thousands of imperial army soldiers could stop the other party. Wu Zhu had come. Wu Zhu had finally come. He had come to avenge the mistress. These words that made his heart tremble echoed endlessly in Gong Dian's heart. Wu Zhu, who stood alone in the wind and rain and used a metal drill to challenge the entire powerful Qing court, did not have these thoughts. He only suddenly said to himself, "The one living inside seems to be Xiao Lizi." The wind and rain filled the sky and this person stood alone. Although there were millions of people, he would go forward. It's the last few days. My feelings are very complicated. Brothers and sisters, please give more recommendation votes and flower votes. Everyone, together, let's make the ending of the story of Qing Yu a little more beautiful, a little more beautiful. Chapter 766. There should be 3 more chapters. There are 3 more chapters. Then there is a final chapter and a postscript. Anger, resentment, sorrow. Let's all vote for the recommendation. Only yesterday did I discover that flower tickets also cost money. Yes, let's work hard together and make a pretty cat tail. Fire the arrows. The pale-faced commander of the imperial army gave the order in a trembling voice as rainwater dripped from Gong Dian's messy beard. Countless arrows left the taut bowstrings. Abruptly their speed rose to a peak. They tore through the rain in the air and shot toward Wu Zhu, who stood alone in the middle of the square. The densely packed arrows seemed like they were going to cover the sky and the sun. However, the torrential rain had stolen this effect first. Thus, it was as if the countless arrows that flew out were dissatisfied. They tore apart all of the raindrops in the air between heaven and earth, making the sky above the square become a large curtain of water like a divine realm. Contrasted with this terrifying power were the sinister whistling of the arrows as they pierced through the air. These sounds represented the Qing kingdom's powerful military power and an irresistible killing intent. No one could survive such a dense arrow attack, not even Fan Xian. Even Yi Luyun on Dong Mountain had only faced a few hundred arrows. Furthermore, in that kind of terrain, a great grandmaster's swift movements had always been their greatest protection. How to kill a great grandmaster? Fan Xian had once thought deeply about this problem. It had to be done on the plains. Tens of thousands of arrows fired in unison and then heavily armored riders charged in succession. Only then could they not give a great grandmaster a chance to escape. Standing alone in the rain, Wu Zhu was very powerful. At least, those who knew his name never thought he was weaker than a great grandmaster. It was clear that the Imperial Army's retreat and release of arrows matched Fan Xian's plan back then. The square was wide. Although it was raining, there was nothing that could block one's line of sight. How could Wu Zhu dodge? There were people who could fight 1 against 10,000. However, when the arrows were fired in unison, it was like the power of 10,000 people coming together. How could they be blocked? Faced with arrows that were even denser than the torrential rain, could Wu Zhu still stand in the center of the plaza with incomparable strength? Wu Zhu's movements were not as fast as Yi Luyun's. Wu Zhu's attacks were not as wild and ruthless as Sigu Jian's. Wu Zhu was unable to use the power of the rain to escape like Ku He. He only raised his head coldly. Separated by the layer of wet black cloth, he looked at the black rain of arrows coming at him. The strong wind pressed against his face and enveloped an area of dozens of feet around him. The tip of the arrow pierced through the raindrops and arrived in front of him. In the present world, the person with the best qinggong should be Fan Xian. With the help of the magic book Ku he had left behind, he could leap over 30 meters on the snowy ground. However, even he, faced with this sky full of arrows, had no way to suddenly move like lightning and leap out of the range of the rain of arrows. Thus Wu Zhu's body did not move. He did not try to avoid this rain of arrows, which had clearly been accumulating power for a long time, because no one could avoid it. He only pulled back the metal rod in the rain and held it horizontally in front of his chest. Like a door, it suddenly closed, locking his figure behind the rain and fog. Thud, thud, thud. The terrifying sound of countless arrows piercing their targets seemed to ring out at the same time. Some of the powerful arrows pierced into the stone tiles under Wu Zhu's feet and bounced up violently. In the air, they could not withstand the great force of the arrows and snapped with a crisp crack. Some of the arrows shot directly into the narrow gaps between the stone tiles. The feathers of the arrows buzzed. In an instant, countless arrows enveloped Wu Zhu's slightly thin body. After countless heart-palpitating sounds, the entire royal palace was silent. Everyone's pupils gradually constricted in fear as they looked at the scene in front of them in disbelief. The arrows were like weeds that had been brushed aside by the spring rain. They were densely inserted into the ground and splashed into the air in the center of the square in front of the royal palace. In the center of the densest rain of arrows, Wu Zhu continued to stand silently. At some point, the bamboo hat that he had always worn was now in his hands. Countless arrows pierced through it. It looked like a black ball of fur, exuding a cold light. His right hand still held the metal drill steadily. Below his right hand were countless arrows that had been broken by him. The rain-soaked square was filled with arrows. Wu Zhu stood among the broken arrows. Other than where his feet were standing, there was a ground full of broken killing intent. It was as if he was the only person left standing on the clean ground in the world. The rain suddenly lessened. It was as if the heavens were beginning to faintly fear this blind man who still stood stubbornly under the tens of thousands of arrows and wanted to see this scene more clearly. Thus, a crack suddenly appeared in the thick rain clouds above the royal palace. The sunlight shone down through the crack and shone on Wu Zhu's body, faintly illuminating this blind man in plain clothes with a clear light. In the light rain, the autumn wind brushed past. Wu Zhu's soaked clothes gently fluttered. With a rustling sound, the bamboo hat in his left hand, which had withstood countless arrows, finally died of old age. In his hand, it scattered in all directions, like a fragile lantern. No one knew what had happened. The Imperial Army had no idea how such a miraculous scene had appeared in the world. The moment the tens of thousands of arrows neared his body, Wu Zhu had actually moved. However, he had moved too quickly. The metal drill in his hand and the straw hat, which was spinning at high speed, all became afterimages in the rain. No one could see them at all. Wu Zhu's feet were like two stakes standing deep in the ground. The metal drill in his right hand seemed to have a life of its own. It completely calculated the trajectory of each arrow. Furthermore, with the powerful execution ability of Wu Zhu's limbs, he inconceivably cut down each arrow that truly pierced toward his body. Earlier, each time the metal drill slashed horizontally, it was forcefully limited by Wu Zhu to within the range of his body. It did not exceed an inch. He allowed the whistling arrows to brush past his clothes, his earlobes and his thighs. He did not even glance at these arrows. The front of his soaked cloth shoes was full of arrows. Wu Zhu did not block them even once. This kind of absolute calculation ability and the confidence that came with it, as well as the valiant will it demonstrated, was not something that could be found in the mortal world. If it was any other great grandmaster, it would probably be impossible for them to be as calm as Wu Zhu earlier. In this world, other than Wu Zhu, no one could calculate so many things in such a short amount of time and, in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint, be able to make the most appropriate response. The tens of thousands of arrows were fired at once. They had to cover all of the areas where Wu Zhu could possibly dodge. Thus, the arrows that actually shot toward Wu Zhu's body were not that many. However, in this world, other than Wu Zhu, who could still make such a calm judgment in such a dangerous moment? Not many was only for Wu Zhu. Even so, the metal drill in his hand could not instantly cut down all of the concentrated arrows flying toward him. Thus his left hand also moved. He directly took off the straw hat he wore on his head and began to spin it quickly in the rain. It swirled up countless arcs of rain and shook away countless arrows. The straw hat shattered like a lantern. With a crash, it fell to the wet ground and sent up countless broken arrows. With some difficulty, Wu Zhu straightened the 5 fingers on his left hand and looked at the arrows that had pierced through his arm. A very real emotion suddenly appeared on his originally expressionless face. It hurts a bit, Wu Zhu thought to himself. He then pulled out the arrows that had pierced deep into his bone and even out of his left forearm. The sound of the arrows rubbing against the flesh of his forearm seemed to cover up the gradually fading sound of the rain. The top and bottom of the royal palace was silent. Clear light shone down through the crack in the sky above Jingdo and shone on Wu Zhu's thin body. Slowly and as if he didn't feel anything, he pulled the arrow out of his body. He then wiped away the liquid flowing from his wound and raised his foot again. When this step landed, the sound of arrows shattering filled the air. Wu Zhu was stepping on the pile of arrows in front of him as he walked toward the royal palace. The morale of the imperial army dropped to its lowest point, even lower than it had been a year ago when that startling sound had been heard. Although the fear of the unknown was terrifying, it was not as terrifying as seeing a monster with their own eyes. They didn't know who the warrior standing tall in the rain of arrows below the royal palace was. Unconsciously, they thought that the other party was not human. He was probably some kind of monster. Or, an immortal? Given the strict discipline of the Qing army, even if they were faced with a great grandmaster who was praised by tens of thousands of people, perhaps they would not pause at all. Instead, they would use a torrential rain of arrows to kill the enemies of the Qing kingdom. However, today they truly felt fear. That was because that expert had not only displayed his unparalleled power, but more importantly, they were shocked by the indifference displayed by that expert. When Wu Zhu stepped on the densely packed pile of arrows that were like long grass in spring and was about to reach the palace gates, the second wave of arrows still did not fall. The pale-faced Gong Dian watched in a daze as the blind man came closer and closer. He suddenly felt a bitterness in his mouth. Sir Wu was already too close to the royal palace. Even if he attacked with arrows again, the effect would probably not be as good as before. Was the mission the emperor had given him truly impossible to complete? In this life, the Qing emperor only feared 2 things. One was the black chest, and the other was Lao Wu, who was walking steadily toward him. In the 20 years after the Taiping courtyard murder case, the emperor had wanted to eliminate Wu Zhu from this world more than once. However, in the end he had still failed. In order to deal with Wu Zhu's revenge, the emperor had his own plans. Fan Xian had returned from the temple, so Wu Zhu had followed him back. The Qing emperor had never hoped for heaven to give him a pleasant surprise. He had actually not prepared much for Wu Zhu because there were not many ways in the world that could keep Wu Zhu in check. Furthermore, the Qing kingdom only had a gradually aging, tired, and injured emperor. Great Master Yi Luyun had long floated far away. In the Qing emperor's view, the only way to eliminate Wu Zhu was this wall of the royal palace, the obstruction of countless imperial soldiers, and the fire that filled the sky. A few years ago, in the wasteland behind the Qing temple, the Qing emperor had personally seen the emissary of the temple gradually melt into a strange object in the fire. He had also heard the crackling sounds with his own ears. Gong Dian was the person specifically carrying out the Qing emperor's plan to eliminate Wu Zhu. For this, the imperial army had prepared fire arrows and corresponding facilities. However, heaven seemed to have truly abandoned the man it had chosen in the world in the autumn of the 12th year of the Qing calendar. When Wu Zhu arrived outside the royal palace with a strange and heavy mood, A storm that was rarely seen in a century in Jingdo suddenly fell from the sky. The pouring rain dealt a heavy blow to Gong Dian's preparations. It was as if he wanted to use this to wash away the past of the Qing court and send off a powerful ruler. Gong Dian took a deep breath and looked at Wu Zhu, who was coming closer and closer. He stopped releasing arrows and ordered in a raspy voice, "Prepare the oil." If he wanted to envelop Wu Zhu below the palace walls in a sea of fire, the explosive poison plan he had set up through the Overwatch Council during the Jingdo Rebellion 4 years ago was, without question, the most powerful. 4 years ago, Fan Xian had already hidden a large amount of gunpowder in the Overwatch Council stockpile under the little building. Most importantly, this rain that filled the sky, this damned rain. Thus, Gong Dian could only hope that the oil would be able to kill Sir Wu below the palace walls. The oil splashed down, but it could not splash onto Wu Zhu's body. Wu Zhu walked slowly and steadily, but he was like an antelope flying on a precipice as he arrived in front of the palace doors. The rain gradually lessened. The imperial soldiers on the palace walls finally lit a dozen fire arrows and shot them all down. The moment the flames touched the oil mixed with the water below the palace walls, they immediately began to burn fiercely. The flames were like a torrential rain rising from the ground, a rain of fire. Abruptly, a giant tongue of flame shot out, wanting to swallow Wu Zhu's lonely figure. Wu Zhu flew up. More accurately, he walked. It completely exceeded all human imaginations. The metal drill in his hand pierced into a crack about 6 feet above the royal palace. His body was like an arrow shot from a bowstring. It sped up rapidly and turned into a cold shadow. On the smooth and straight palace walls, his feet crossed endlessly as he ran toward the palace walls. No one could describe this scene. Wu Zhu was on the road on the palace walls running toward the rainy sky. When Wu Zhu's feet, wearing cloth shoes, landed firmly on the palace walls, Gong Dian knew that the situation was lost. In this world, other than the emperor, there was no one else who could stop Wu Zhu from entering the palace. Under the autumn rain, a thunderous sound of horse hooves suddenly came from a corner of the square. There were not many riders, but they were particularly stern. The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, currently the foremost person in the Qing military, Commander Yi Zhong, had finally rushed over from the Bureau of Military Affairs. Yi Zhong's expression was shocked and ashen. The rain made his grizzled hair stick to his slightly black face. He looked unusually wretched. He looked at the lonely, blind figure on the palace walls from a distance. He jumped off his horse and sprinted wildly toward the palace walls in the rain. He almost tripped and fell. In a stern voice he yelled, "Sir Wu, don't be rash. I know the temple has been abandoned, but I thought that since Lao Wu is a person of the temple would have a way to keep him there. Who knew that he would actually be able to return to the world? Why did the wicked heavens have to rain so heavily today? Why is this so? I have the world in my heart and control tens of thousands of li of rivers and mountains in my hands. Unexpectedly, I have been forced in front of me by a man. Who can tell me why? How unfair the heavens are. If I was given a few more days, no, if I had not been injured by that chest that day, why would I fear Lao Wu coming? But even if Lao Wu came? So what? The emperor, who occasionally heard urgent reports from outside the palace but still maintained a calm expression, suddenly had a cold smile rise to the corners of his lips. Slowly rising from the throne, he steadily raised his hands and had Eunuch Yao at his side carefully check for wrinkles on his dragon robe. There were many kinds of dragon robes. The one the Qing emperor was wearing was very close to his body. Presumably it would not affect his attack later. However, why did the wrinkles at the corners of the emperor's eyes appear so tired? So faint and sorrowful? Standing in the quiet and empty Taiji palace, the Qing emperor put his hands behind his back and was silent for a long time. His hair had been neatly combed and carelessly tied with a light yellow ribbon at the back of his head. He appeared particularly elegant. After a long time he slowly opened his eyes. There was no longer the faint self-mockery in them when he questioned himself earlier. There was only calmness and powerful confidence. The emperor's calm and cold gaze followed the open doors of Taiji Palace, passed through the square in front of the palace, and continued toward the main gates of the royal palace, where the sounds of killing were gradually rising. He knew that Lao Wu would come from there in a moment. He knew Lao Wu's personality. In his life he would only take the most direct path. Have you found Fan Xian? His eyelids were slightly lowered as he gently turned a jade ring between his fingers. He asked casually. Not yet, Eunuch Yao reported respectfully to the side. The young lady of the Fan family disappeared last night. The emperor closed his eyes and thought deeply for a moment. He then said, It looks like I have still underestimated many people, such as Ruoruo. Eunuch Yao didn't dare to continue. He only felt that it was unusually strange. After the palace learned of the accurate news that Fan Xian had entered the capital, the emperor had invited the young lady of the Fan family into the palace at the first opportunity. It was clear that the emperor had his hands on Fan Xian's lifeline. However, the young lady of the Fan family had suddenly disappeared from the palace. If the young lady of the Fan family was a hidden ace, why had she been invited into the palace by the internal court and not escaped outside the palace? The tens of thousands of imperial soldiers outside the royal palace were still using their flesh and blood to stubbornly stop Wu Zhu from entering. The path was covered in blood, but not a single imperial soldier took a step back. Even when Sigu Jian used a wooden stick to kill ants under the tree, he still needed time. Furthermore, he was killing people now. Wu Zhu continued to kill calmly. However, the people in front of him never decreased. No one knew how much longer he would have to kill. There's still an hour left. The emperor always seemed to be able to accurately grasp the development of everything in the world. He slowly walked out of Taiji Palace and stood in the long corridor. Looking at the increasingly sparse rain outside, he seemed to be deep in thought. The eunuchs and serving girls in the royal palace retreated far away with nervous expressions. There was only Eunuch Yao by the emperor's side. He appeared very lonely. The emperor's brows suddenly furrowed and he gently coughed a few times. He accepted a pure white silk handkerchief from Eunuch Yao's hand and wiped the corner of his mouth. Coldly he said, "If Nji still doesn't act, this matter will be interesting." The atmosphere in the royal palace was unusually tense and serious. There was not a trace of liveliness. It was rather boring. Fan Xian was among the eunuchs at the end of Taiji Palace's long corridor. He watched the middle-aged man in the distance, or perhaps it should be said, old man, with unusually heavy and complicated emotions. Just after midnight, Fan Xian had come alone to the royal palace under the cover of the pitch-black night. This time he did not try to do what he had done that year after the poetry conference in front of the palace and climb into the palace like a gecko. In Jingdo, because of the raging war in the north and more so because of his return, the defenses had been raised to a terrifying level. It was already an impossible task to climb over the wall and enter. Thus, Fan Xian used the chess piece he had buried the deepest in this world. Other than him, only Wang Qinian knew about this chess piece. Deng Ziyu only had a faint understanding of it. It was Hongzhu. Presently, Hongzhu had returned to the royal study and was once again favored. With the secret guidance and help of this popular figure in the palace, Fan Xian appeared relaxed, but in reality, it was extremely dangerous to sneak into the royal palace through the direction of the laundry workshop. Fan Xian had not thought about what the consequences would be if Hongzhu sold him out. He had already come this far in his second life. What else did he not dare to lose? After sneaking into the royal palace, Fan Xian learned of the news that his sister had once again been received into the royal palace. He immediately understood the emperor's thoughts. It looked like at this moment of life and death, the man sitting on the throne had finally torn off all pretense and was prepared to directly use Ruoruo's life to threaten him. This was different from when Ruoruo had been a hostage. At that time, the emperor had enough confidence in him, so he could still maintain his face as a saint. Fan Xian was also not worried that he would actually use his sister's life to threaten him. Now the emperor was already old. His lingering injuries had not healed at all. He probably also smelled a glimmer of death. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and carefully lowered his head. Behind the serving girls, he gazed at the emperor in front of Taiji Palace through the gaps in their clothes. For a moment, his emotions were complicated. He also knew of the strange movements in the royal palace and guessed Uncle Wu Zhu's arrival. However, he could not understand. Had Uncle Wu Zhu truly woken up? No matter what, Fan Xian knew the strength of these powerful warriors and the powerful battle power of the Qing army. Even if Wu Zhu valiantly broke through the imperial army's defenses, he would still be injured when he came to Taiji Palace. Faced with the calm and unruffled emperor, what were Uncle Wu Zhu's chances of victory? Chapter 767. On the third day from the end, it was raining in Jingdo of the Qin kingdom. It was snowing in Nanjing. Light snow drifted gracefully and slowly through the air, filling the air with the coldness between heaven and earth. However, it still dropped the temperature to a level that humans detested. On the majestic city walls of Nanjing, the general of the Nanjing Military Department, Shang Shanpa, who was responsible for northern Qi's southern defense line, looked at the plains to the southwest with an indifferent expression. There was no snow on the plains. One could still see the hibernating black fertile soil. His gaze pierced through the layers of wind and snow and landed on the solemn Qing military camp that had lasted for decades. The flags there fluttered in the wind and snow. The endless blackness stopped silently in the wind and snow. It was like a temporarily resting beast that could leap toward Nanjing at any moment. The Qing kingdom's Yanjing camp and northern camp had attacked with all their might. During this period of time, they had successively broken through 3 defense lines laid down by the northern Qi army. Like a prairie fire, they headed straight north. Along the way they had killed countless northern Qi soldiers. They were now 20 li in front of the Nanjing defense line and were resting and reorganizing. It looked like the bloodiest and cruelest siege battle between 2 large countries was about to erupt at the foot of Nanjing. Shang Shampa couldn't resist narrowing his eyes. His palm gently stroked the scabbard at his side. He looked at his subordinates moving quickly like ants around him, preparing to defend the city in the icy weather. He sensed the tense and panicked atmosphere that filled the city and couldn't help but sigh. More than 100,000 Qing Iron Riders were already pressing in. How long could the most important city in the south of the Qi kingdom under him hold out? Shang Shampa shook his head and sent out a number of military orders to his subordinate officers. He then turned and descended the city walls to the temporary frontline tent that had been set up below the city walls. This tent was remote and quiet. It was personally guarded by his trusted soldiers outside. He did not have to worry about anyone getting close. Once he entered the tent, Shang Shampa looked at the man wearing commoner's clothing but was still powerful without anger. Very straightforwardly, he knelt down on one knee and said in a low voice, "Father, it looks like Wang Jikuan has lost his courage after the ambush a few days ago. He probably won't attack the city within 3 days." Everyone in the world thought that the pillar of the northern Qi military, Commander Shang Shanhu, who the Qing kingdom feared the most, should still be in the city of the Song kingdom between the waist of the Qing army. Who would have thought that just as the battle in Nanjing was about to break out, this valiant general would come to Nanjing alone without anyone noticing? Shang Shanhu's black silkworm eyebrows twitched slightly. A moment later he said in a low voice, "Although Wang Jikuan's marching is a bit conservative, he is not a coward. Otherwise, why would the Qing emperor let him lead the Yanjing army for a dozen years? The harassment these days looks like my army has taken advantage. In reality he is like a turtle. He has not been lured out of any troops at all." Shang Shampa listened to his father's buzzing voice echoing through the tent. A glimmer of admiration appeared in his eyes as he looked at his father. His father had secretly returned to Nanjing for some time. He had to prepare to welcome the great battle that was about to arrive. If his father had not secretly moved troops like a god and used the 3 lines of defense to cut through, it would have been impossible for the Qing Iron Riders to take so long to reach Nanjing. Wang Jikuan is truly shameless to the extreme. They clearly have the advantage in military power and are at their peak. Yet they put on a defensive posture on the plains. Thinking of this, Shang Shampa couldn't help but curse out loud. They don't seek to be meritorious but to not make mistakes. This is where Wang Jikuan's power lies. The Qing kingdom. Shang Shanhu suddenly pulled back his gaze from the map and looked outside the tent. He sighed and said, "They have many soldiers and many generals. I can't take advantage of them." A glimmer of exhaustion suddenly appeared on the face of this famous northern Qi general. He had returned to Nanjing from the Song kingdom because he was truly worried about the defenses here. Once the Qing Iron Riders actually broke through the Nanjing defense line, the center of the northern Qi court would directly face the flames of war from the south. The court would have to fall into chaos. Shang Shanhu had used a plan to split himself. The Qing Iron Riders still thought he was still in the Song kingdom's capital and were probably extremely worried. However, he was secretly in Nanjing presiding over this line of defense. There was only one Shang Shanhu. Using this method he was able to display more effect than just one Shang Shanhu. Faced with the Qing kingdom's strict military discipline, excellent military equipment, and unusually valiant soldiers of over 100,000, no matter how skilled Shang Shanhu was at using troops, it was impossible for him to feel relaxed, particularly since this was not a field battle. It was a head-on collision between 2 large countries on the Nanjing defense line. In the end, it was still a battle of national strength and vigor. Shang Shanhu was not afraid of Wang Jikuan. He understood his counterpart in the south too well, so he was not afraid. These years, he had presided over the northern Qi military in the south. He had always kept his gaze focused on the royal palace in the distant Jingdo. He had always thought he understood the Qing emperor's military thinking. If the Qing kingdom truly wanted to carry out a northern expedition, then, according to theory, they would have to gather all the power of the entire country to attack the north. They would have to gather at least 3 roads of troops and forcefully push forward with an unstoppable force. However, there were only 2 roads of border troops outside Nanjing. The Qing Emperor's boldness did not seem to be as powerful as he had imagined. Shang Shanhu narrowed his eyes slightly. His heart was heavy with worry. He thought to himself, what exactly is the ruler of the south thinking? Is there some trick that I haven't seen through? Would he still be able to defend this country? As a general, the most important thing was confidence. In front of the Qing kingdom's powerful military, Shang Shanhu did not have the confidence to fight and win. He believed that he could stop the Qing kingdom's northern expedition for a period of time, but for how long? A kind of exhaustion took hold of Shang Shanhu's heart. He suddenly thought of the secret edict the emperor had sent a few days ago. He had heard that Fan Xian of the Qing kingdom had already returned from the temple and should be in Jingdo by now. Was the fate of the Qi kingdom going to be entrusted to the Qing emperor's illegitimate child? Would Fan Xian kill the Qing emperor? Could it kill the Qing emperor? While Shang Shanhu was watching the Qing army camp dozens of li away from inside Nanjing, the Qing kingdom's military camp had already been set up. In the wind and snow, Commander Wang Jikuan was also using a cold gaze to look at the large city in the distance. As long as they broke through that city, the Qing army's most powerful riders would be able to kill their way into the heart of northern Qi. At that time they would sweep away everything. Although they would still have to face the 2 lines of defense in front of Shangjing, presumably it would be much easier to fight than it was now. While they were attacking Nanjing, they had to defend against Shang Shanhu in the city of the Song kingdom behind them. Although the Qing army's offensive was steady, it lacked the heroic aura of when they were expanding the borders. When will Shi Fei arrive? Wang Jikuan asked. A deputy general beside him replied without hesitation, the general should arrive in 4 days. Wang Jikuan nodded his head with some relief. At the beginning of the northern expedition, the emperor had already drawn up all of the plans. Although, like Shang Shanhu in the distant Nanjing, Wang Jikuan sometimes felt that the emperor's boldness this time was not as great as it was in the past, his confidence in the emperor had never weakened. The emperor wanted to send Shi Fei to take over control of the wild army in the northern camp. This did not make Wang Jikuan feel any negative feelings. He did not mind others stealing his credit. He also did not think that the emperor did not trust him because Shi Fei had been his deputy general in the past. Furthermore, the northern expedition was a war to unify the world. No general dared to hope that they could accomplish such a great feat with their own strength. Wang Jikuan occasionally thought that at least he was better than Commander Yi. Commander Ye's current status was too noble. He could only give orders from the Bureau of Military Affairs in Jingdo and was unable to personally lead troops like him. How many years had he prepared? Wang Jikuan stood at the entrance of the tent and allowed the snowflakes to fall on his armor. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the distant city of Nanjing. Thinking that his feet were actually already standing on northern Qi territory, a boundless heroic feeling suddenly rose in his heart. He had guarded Yanjing for the emperor for over a dozen years just for this day. The majestic picture was in front of his eyes. How could there be any regret in life? Suddenly, a glimmer of coldness flashed through Wang Jikuan's eyes. His body trembled slightly. Although it was freezing cold, there were no problems with the Qing army's logistics and aura. However, there was always a strong sense of unease in his heart. Sir Fan Jr. had returned to Jingdo. Would the emperor be well? The northern Qi royal palace was built against the mountain. There was a mountain stream on the mountain. The stream flowed along the mountain path until it formed a clear pool at the very bottom. Beside the pool were stones. The clear water in the pool flowed out of the palace through a purposely opened gap. The northern Qi emperor wore a large cloak with a dragon robe underneath. His eyebrows were raised slightly like swords, and his lips were tightly pressed together. Just like this, he sat by the gap in the pool and was silent for a long time without saying a word. Haitang stood by his side with her back to him. Her gaze followed the clear water flowing out of the pool until it reached outside the beautiful royal palace and the river that slowly flowed through Shangjing in winter. Before the Dong Mountain incident, Master Ku He had talked with the Empress Dowager in this pool and decided on some things before floating away. In the end, he returned dispiritedly and died of old age. He had lost to the Qing emperor. Presently, the northern Qi court was once again facing the threat of the powerful ruler in the south. However, this time the threat was more real and direct. Countless Qing iron riders had already stepped onto the road to invade the north. No one knew when they would destroy this ancient capital and set this beautiful black royal palace on fire. I cannot put all my hopes on him. The northern Qi emperor's sword-like brows were slightly flat. His expression was slightly light. Slowly he said, Although I believe there is an irreconcilable hatred between him and the Qing Emperor is, after all, his father. As for Fan Xian's fickle and naive emotions, I probably understand them better than many people. Most importantly, according to my aunt disciple, that blind great master has already become an idiot. The Northern Qi Emperor lowered his head and looked at his slightly distorted face in the water. Suddenly, he felt that the coldness between heaven and earth had become an unprecedented burden, pressing down on him until he almost couldn't breathe. With slight disappointment he said, "If that is truly the case, then who can kill that ruler in the Qing royal palace? Everyone knows of the Qing people's ambitions. I have prepared for this for many years. Only when the battle began did I realize that I had still underestimated the valiance of the Qing army." The Northern Qi Emperor raised his face. A glimmer of determination flashed through his eyes. "It is only 2 roadside armies, yet they can kill their way to Nanjing. If the Qing Emperor truly brought the entire country to attack, even Shang Shanhu would not be able to hold out for long. If General Shang Shanhu cannot hold out, what does your Majesty plan to do?" Haitang slowly turned around and asked calmly. "Use the power of the entire country to fight," the Northern Qi Emperor replied with a slight smile. He didn't think at all. "In the end, this world is my world. Even if jade is to shatter, it will shatter in my hands. I have never had any thoughts of admitting defeat." Haitang didn't say anything else. She only looked calmly out of the palace and toward the south with her hands gently pressed together. In the territory controlled by Dongyi at the border between the Song Kingdom and the Liang Kingdom, the land was blown by the sea breeze. It had warmer and more humid weather than Shangjing and Jingdo. The trees in the mountains still retained a rare green color. Who would have known that after crossing the mountain ridge in front of them, passing through the Song Kingdom, and passing through that small provincial city, they would come to a harsh and snowy land. That snowy land was where the Qing Kingdom had sent out its troops. After Northern Qi retreated and firmly defended it, countless people had fought and died. The great prince of the Qing Kingdom, who had rebelled against the Qing court alone and had been silent in the world for over a year, was now in the mountains that were as warm as spring. He stared straight at the sky and imagined the harsh wind and snow. Behind him were over 10,000 loyal subordinates. There was a black line in the mountains. It was the 4,000 black knights that Fan Xian had given him. However, Jinggu led these black knights and did not seem to be willing to listen to him. If 13th Wang had not returned to Dongyi and brought Jinggu Fan Xian's personally written military order, the great prince would not have been able to do anything to him. The great prince pulled back his gaze and glanced at 13th Wang beside him. There was not a trace of emotion on his heroic face. Although the number of soldiers he led was not large, it was the most powerful force that Dongyi relied on. If they joined the battle between the two countries, particularly if they fought their way out of the Song Kingdom that Shang Shanhu had miraculously taken last year, they would probably bring results that would shock the world. However, Fan Xian did not request or beg him to do this. Fan Xian only gave all of his power to his big brother. Then, through 13th Wang's mouth, he told him his analysis of the situation in the world. After that he said nothing more. The great prince kicked his horse lightly. With a silent expression, he led the 10,000 elite soldiers toward the northwest. After a few breaths, the 4,000 black knights above the mountains also began to move with an eternally unchanging somberness and the aura of the netherworld. Immediately silent, he knew very well why Fan Xian did not have any specific words for him. He was the same as Fan Xian. Although they both had Dongyi blood, they were, after all, Qing people. Most of these 14,000 powerful elite soldiers were also Qing people. If the Qing kingdom was on a northern expedition, were they going to betray the court and strike back? Probably no one would do such a thing. Although these people were all exiled and had no loyalty to the emperor, betraying the monarch and treason were, in the end, two different concepts. However, Dongyi could not just watch as the Qing emperor broke apart northern Qi in one go. If that happened, Dongyi would become the powerful Qing army's second target. In name, Dongyi already belonged to the Qing kingdom. Under Fan Xian and the great prince's power, the Qing court could not control this place. Once there was an opportunity to mobilize troops and truly conquer, the Qing court would not pass up the opportunity. At that time, Dongyi would be destroyed, and the great prince would only have death awaiting him. From the moment Qin Pingping died, the great prince had already mentally prepared himself for this. Now that he knew what Fan Xian was preparing to do in Jingdo, the great prince's heart still couldn't suppress the darkness. Regardless of whether Fan Xian won or lost, his mood would still be dark because that person was his father. His mother was still in the Qing royal palace, and his wife and concubines were still in Jingdo. The great prince slowly raised his head and looked in the direction of Jingdo. For a moment he sighed. Narrowing his eyes slightly, he was silent for a long time without saying a word. The great battle had already begun. The shuraba had already been laid out. Bones were buried in the road, blood and flesh splattered on the wilderness, and crows cried strangely in the wind and snow. Endless severity and danger enveloped the entire world. It was like a shadow that could not be moved away, covering the sky above the heads of millions of common people. Amidst such a tense situation, many people's gazes, including the valiant generals on the battlefield, the supreme emperor and the solitary unfilial son, were actually all focused on Jingdo. They knew that the true victory or defeat, the direction of the world, was still in the Qing kingdom's Jingdo, between the father and son who were particularly cruel and merciless to others. Just as the Qing emperor had once said to Yuan, the life and death survival between him and Fan Xian was the true point of the game. However, this situation was not something a person could set up. Rather, it was the result of decades of karma and fate. In the process of this formation, the emperor himself, the dead woman, Qin Pingping in the autumn rain, and even Fan Xian himself had all added fuel to the fire. Thus, in the end, there was no solution to this situation and it became a dead end. Only a sword could cut the knot. Only life and death could release it. In Jingdo, watched by countless eyes, the common people did not feel much of the stench of blood on the front lines. They didn't even know about the shocking event happening in the imperial palace. Their emotions were calm as they passed their days as usual, other than the common people at the crossroads of the Qianhe, who were crying endlessly. In the scholar's manner, the scholar could not hear these cries, but he knew at the first instant what had happened in the royal palace. It was not a day for the court conference, but he still had enough spies and ranks so he was immediately dumbfounded. A year ago, all of the officials of the He faction had been killed by Fan Xian and the Overwatch Council. During this year, the scholar led the Hall of Governmental Affairs as well as the 3 temples, 3 schools and 6 ministries. He managed the Qing court in good order. Even when the emperor was heavily injured and could not attend to matters, this scholar remained calm and indifferent. His expression did not change even when Dong Mountain collapsed in front of him. He effectively maintained the peace of the Qing kingdom. However, when he learned of this news, all of the scholar's calmness immediately collapsed. He had not put on face cream, so the wrinkles on his face appeared particularly deep. Standing in a daze in the garden of the scholar's manor, he appeared particularly old. He prayed that the heavens would not bring any misfortune to the Qing kingdom. In a simple and crude private residence in another poor place in Jingdo, the previous Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, who had been released from prison a long time ago, was coughing and drinking medicine with the support of his daughter, the young lady of the Sun family. He had been tormented in prison to the point of almost dying. If it were not for a few madams in the Fan Manor secretly taking care of him, this stern Jingdo magistrate would probably have died long ago. However, the Sun family had long declined. Other than 3 generations of the family, all of the servants had left. The concubine had also escaped. Their days were truly unbearable. Sun Pinner comforted her father in a warm voice. In her heart, she was thinking that she would probably have to go to the Fan Manor to thank the princess for the medicine. However, she didn't have any clothes to wear. She also thought Sir Fan Jr. was now poor. Was he dead or alive? For a moment she couldn't help but feel dazed. In the Fan Manor, Lin Wanner was sitting in the flower hall with a serious expression. Cece sat behind her. Each of them was holding a child. She said to the wife of the Teng family in front of her, "There is no need to escape. However, if the servants in the manor can scatter, then scatter as much as possible." The wife of the Teng family vaguely guessed something and was unwilling to leave. Lin Wanner would not force it. Even if these family members of the Fan clan wanted to leave, they would probably not be able to leave cleanly. She only looked in a daze at Fan Liang in her arms. Last night, Fan Ruoruo had been urgently summoned into the palace. Recently, there had been no news of the emperor being unwell. Lin Wanner immediately guessed something. In particular, since last night, the strange atmosphere that had begun to pervade the capital made her even more confident. "You are still alive. Why don't you go home and have a look? Even if Uncle wants to kill you and you want to kill Uncle, but, were you not willing to let me see you one last time?" As soon as she thought of this, she was overcome with sadness. A few drops of tears fell from her eyes and landed on Fan Liang's puzzled face. While Lin Wanner was helplessly and sorrowfully worried about Fan Xian's life and death, Fan Ruoruo, who had been summoned into the palace last night, had successfully escaped the watch of the aces of the internal court and disappeared into the depths of the palace. The royal palace was in a mess. For a moment, it was impossible to find her whereabouts. It looked like this girl was not only successful in her studies on Qing Mountain. The training Wu Zhu gave her on that snowy night in the Tsang Mountains was far more successful than his teaching of Fan Xian. She was wearing the clothes of a serving girl, but it gave off a moving feeling. Her clothes fluttered slowly in the light rain. Following the walls of the palace, she slowly walked in the direction of Taiji Palace. Along the way, she saw the eunuchs and serving girls, whose faces were pale from the sounds of fighting, sneaking in the direction of the rear palace. No one cared who she was or what she was doing there. Just as she was about to turn into a remote palace door in Taiji Palace, she saw eunuch Hongzhu. It seemed that Hongzhu had been waiting for her for a long time. The two of them looked at each other calmly. Fan Ruoruo looked calmly at Hongzhu. In reality, countless thoughts were running through her mind. She had no idea why a few months ago, this popular chief eunuch had suddenly contacted her in secret. Hongzhu left the palace door with his body bent. He didn't explain anything because he had thought Sir Fan Jr. was already dead. After thinking for a long time, what little he had hidden in his bones finally allowed him to find the young lady of the Fan family and tell her about his relationship with Fan Xian. Perhaps this eunuch did not want her to guard the secret between him and Fan Xian and wait alone in the depths of the palace. Fan Ruoruo knew that her brother was still alive and had snuck into the royal palace with the help of this eunuch. This reality made her very happy. Immediately after, her joy turned into deep worry because she knew why her brother had entered the palace. She walked to the side of the palace gate and walked to the side of a large copper vat filled with water. Through the palace gate, she could hear the heart-palpitating sounds coming from the palace walls not far away, the sounds of iron drills piercing through armor and bones. The worry between her brows grew even heavier. She knew that even her teacher had come today. Then, through the crack in the palace door, she looked at the bright yellow figure in the distance in front of the main hall of Taiji Palace. She pressed her lips together slightly. After a long silence, she finally made up her mind. The emperor held his hands behind his back. His hands gripped the white handkerchief slightly tightly in his sleeves. Only he knew that the white handkerchief was stained with blood like peach blossoms. He had coughed up blood. Was he really going to die? Eunuch Yao had already been chased away by him. At this moment there was not a single guard around him. Standing in front of the curtain of rain, he appeared very lonely. In the light rain in front of him, an even lonelier figure slowly walked over. Wu Zhu had finally come. The light rain continued to drip endlessly onto the black cloth on his face. The metal drill he held tightly in his hand continued to drip blood. An aura filled with the scent of blood seeped out from his soaked clothes. After killing an unknown number of imperial soldiers, Wu Zhu finally walked step by step from the direction of the royal palace to this place. The usually indestructible metal drill in his hand had pierced through countless tough armors and countless throats. At this moment, the sharp tip of the drill had been ground flat. The body of the drill had begun to bend. Wu Zhu was not human, but he was also not a god. In the face of the world's elite battle power, wave after wave, under the unscrupulous attacks, he was still injured. On the road down from the royal palace, the imperial soldiers wearing heavy armor used their bodies as giant rocks to control the enemy and blocked in front of him. They successfully delayed his steps and injured his body. The imperial soldiers' interception could not be said to not be heroic, but Wu Zhu still managed to kill his way out. Only the iron drill in his hand was already useless, his tightly bound black hair had long been disheveled, the cloth clothes on his body had even more holes, the clothes below his waist even more so for some reason had been burned into pieces. What was most frightening was that in the chaotic battle, the blind youth's leg seemed to have been broken by some heavy weapon. It was twisted to the side and back at an angle that did not conform to common sense. It looked like the bone had been twisted into a strange shape. It was impossible for him to walk. However, Wu Zhu continued to walk. Separated by the layer of black cloth that was about to fall off, he stared at the Qing emperor below. Using the deformed metal drill in his hand as a walking stick, he dragged his already useless left leg and walked with great difficulty and stubbornly in the rain until he reached the Qing emperor. The rain had long lightened and was pattering down. There was still water on the stone tiles in front of Taiji Palace. Wu Zhu's twisted left leg dragged in the rain and made a terrifying sound from the friction. With each friction, the corners of Wu Zhu's thin lips twitched slightly. Presumably he also felt pain. However, he had already forgotten the pain. He only walked step by step toward the Qing emperor in front of the palace. The Qing emperor quietly watched Wu Zhu come closer and closer. Suddenly he said, "I have finally confirmed that you are not an inanimate object." If you are an inanimate object, how could you have such powerful love and hate? The tightly closed palace doors suddenly opened wide. Yi Zhong, covered in filth, rode on a horse. Leading the remaining imperial soldiers and his own family's riders, he rushed toward Taiji Palace. The sound of hooves was like thunder, shaking up the rainwater on the ground and making it tremble. In an instant, hundreds of Qing elite soldiers once again surrounded Wu Zhu. However, they looked at Wu Zhu, who was surrounded by them, at the man who was already twisted but still standing stubbornly. There was not a trace of joy in them. Particularly, the dozen or so Qing temple ascetic monks who had suddenly appeared beside the emperor. The powerful ascetic monks wearing straw hats paled and trembled all over when they saw Wu Zhu, particularly when they saw the color of the liquid flowing out of Wu Zhu's wounds. The blood flowing out of Wu Zhu's body was also hot and red. However, it was golden red. Gradually fading in the light rain, not many people noticed it. However, the ascetic monks wearing straw hats did. All of the ascetic monks seemed to have been struck by lightning. They knelt in the rain in front of Wu Zhu. They were the Qing Emperor's most powerful personal defense. In this moment they had no choice but to submit in front of this blind cripple. Chapter 768. On the second to last day I have been writing slowly and ceaselessly. There will come a time when I finish. The rain slowly landed on the bamboo hats. The ascetic monks knelt on the wet ground with pale faces. They stared in a daze at the blind youth in the middle covered by a black cloth. For a long time they could not make any reaction. They were the Qing Emperor's last line of defense. When a dozen ascetic monks joined hands, even Fan Xian and the Shadow had almost been killed. It was clear how powerful they were. Now, facing Wu Zhu, would they turn around and attack? The Emperor stood in the long corridor in front of the palace. The fine cold rain in the sky was blown by the wind to where he stood and wet the beard on his chin. He narrowed his eyes slightly. The coldness in them grew. Coldly he said, "Useless things. A traitor from the temple has scared you so much." Strangely, the emperor did not seem worried that these ascetic monks would betray him at this moment. Many years ago, the emissary from the temple had made some kind of agreement with the emperor in order to remove all traces Yi Qingmei had left in this world. It was from that day onwards that the ascetic monks of the Qing temple who traveled the south saw the emperor as the true chosen one. Between the chosen one and the emissary of the temple, what choice should they make? The ascetic monks were silent. They, who were gradually getting older, knew of the oracle that the emissary had issued many years ago. They knew that an emissary had fallen, but they didn't know if that emissary was the person in front of them. The emperor paid no attention to the ascetic monks kneeling in the rain. He only looked calmly at Wu Zhu in the rain. After a moment of silence he said, "There has never been a god in this world." "I'm not." "Lao Wu, you are not either." Wu Zhu's leg had already been broken. He used a poignant posture to barely stand. The person from the temple had returned to the world. Faced with the most powerful martial force in the world, he had bravely killed his way over. He had still paid a heavy price. The emperor was right. He was not a god. Thus, in this year he had been betrayed one after another and injured by weapons that did not belong to this world. His injuries lingered and he was no longer at his peak. However, Wu Zhu had already reached his most broken and powerless state. Who would win in the battle between these two peerless experts? Furthermore, Yi Zhong had already led his troops and surrounded Wu Zhu. Could Wu Zhu still break through the heavy encirclement and pierce the metal rod in his hand into the Qing Emperor's throat? The Emperor's cold gaze fell on Wu Zhu's tattered clothes and his broken left leg, which was only held together by some flesh and skin. There was not a trace of emotion in his eyes, but in his heart, he was thinking at this time, "You still won't come out." Gradually, a complicated emotion charged into the Qing Emperor's eyes. It was self-mockery, a glimmer of admiration and a glimmer of dissatisfaction. Wu Zhu had already fallen into a tight encirclement. No matter how powerful he was, he could not overturn the heavens with one hand. Yet Fan Xian still had not shown himself. Such coldness and forbearance was truly frightening. Wearing the clothes of a eunuch, Fan Xian appeared to be very far from the front door of Taiji Palace, but in reality he was very close. He carefully hid his tracks. Relying on his state of mind, which had been tempered to the extreme these 2 years, he controlled his breathing. Using the wind and rain that filled the sky and the heavy and nervous breathing of countless people present, he slowly approached. From the moment he saw the emperor cough, Fan Xian confirmed the top-secret intelligence he had learned on the road south. The emperor's body seemed to be on the verge of death. It had been almost a year since he had seen this powerful ruler. Looking at him from afar through the rain, it seemed that his face had become much older. The beard on his chin had grown much longer, and his expression seemed much more tired. The emperor had already walked down the altar. He stood calmly under the eaves of Taiji Palace and watched Wu Zhu walk over step by step. He still appeared powerful, so powerful that anyone who tried to challenge him would unconsciously lose a third of their confidence. Fan Xian saw Wu Zhu's wretched state. He had never thought that there would be a day when Uncle Wu Zhu would be so heavily injured. Just as he had never thought that there would be someone in this world who could break through the defenses of the Qing royal palace, kill thousands of soldiers, and come in front of the Qing emperor. His gaze swept past Uncle Wu Zhu's broken leg. He forcefully suppressed his wildly beating heart and the glimmer of fear, worry, sadness, and bitterness in his heart. He continued to hide in the shadows of Taiji Palace, coldly and valiantly waiting for the opportunity to strike. Uncle Wu Zhu had already reached the most dangerous moment, but he still did not strike. He knew that before the emperor and Wu Zhu collided head-on, any strike he made would be meaningless. A battle between great grandmasters was not something mortals like him could casually interfere in. He didn't want to waste Uncle Wu Zhu's earth-shattering attack, so he had to endure. Yi Zhong was still there and Eunuch Yao was nowhere to be seen. He didn't know if those ascetic monks would strike. There were still many aces gathered in the royal palace. Fan Xian had to attract everyone's attention and put his hope of exhausting the emperor's strength on Uncle Wu Zhu, who was already on the verge of collapse and had suffered terrible injuries. Regardless of who it was, including the three old monsters who had already died and left, if they were to suffer such a serious injury as Wu Zhu had, they would probably only be able to accept death. However, Wu Zhu was still standing. This gave Fan Xian confidence, and it also gave the people in the royal palace boundless pressure. Separated by the black cloth, Wu Zhu looked at the bright yellow figure on the stone steps a dozen feet away. The man was already much older than he remembered. For some reason, endless sourness, pain, loathing, and disdain welled up in his heart. After the Dong Mountain matter ended and he listened to Fan Xian's drunken ramblings on the roof of the Fan Manor in Jingdo, Wu Zhu silently stepped onto the path of searching for himself. He wanted to know who he was, so he returned to the temple. The moment he entered the temple, he remembered many things. Naturally, he was able to deduce many things. Although the temple forcefully erased his memories in the next moment, as Fan Xian came to the temple, Wu Zhu's memories had not completely recovered. However, the deepest emotion he had before it was erased had remained. This emotion was stronger and more direct than his feelings for Fan Xian. It drew him to calmly look at the royal palace for 2 days. It drew him to kill his way into the palace from outside the square of the royal palace. Even though he didn't remember the events of the past, he still remembered the man wearing the dragon robe on the stone steps and the murderous intent he had toward this man. Fan Xian wanted Wu Zhu to follow his heart. Wu Zhu's heart was filled with boundless sourness, particularly after he saw Little Li. This sourness seemed to have found a way to vent. He was going to kill him. He only remembered this. Wu Zhu moved. He dragged his crippled leg and relied on the metal rod in his hand for support. With great difficulty but full of murderous intent, he dragged it step by step, rubbing against the rainwater on the ground. His uninjured leg was impatient. It was as if he wanted to jump as he walked toward the emperor on the stone steps. The moment Wu Zhu moved, the aces of the Qing army surrounding him also moved. With an earth-shaking cry, countless long weapons pierced toward his body. The ascetic monks kneeling by Wu Zhu's side finally could not withstand this powerful pressure and also moved. Some ascetic monks floated back into the wind and rain while others blocked in front of Wu Zhu. From this scene, it could be seen that the Qing emperor held a supreme position in these ascetic monks' hearts. Even though they knew Wu Zhu was an emissary from the temple, the Qing emperor's call of a traitor still made some ascetic monks choose to believe the emperor. Wu Zhu moved. The situation immediately changed. No one noticed that when most of the ascetic monks between the emperor and Wu Zhu floated back into the wind and rain, opening up a path for Wu Zhu to face the emperor directly, an ascetic monk wearing a straw hat and hemp clothing floated diagonally to the side and back. Intentionally or not, he disturbed the attacks of the military aces. The moment Wu Zhu moved, Yi Zhong, who sat on his horse with a spear in hand, gathered his qi around his entire body. The moment Wu Zhu moved, killing intent flared in his eyes. He kicked the horse's belly. The horse neighed. The long spear moved like lightning toward Wu Zhu's slightly slanted back. Of the people present, probably only Yi Zhong had experienced the events in Qing Kingdom's Jingdo many years ago. Thus, he knew better than anyone else how terrifying Wu Zhu was. He was a powerful warrior who could face Uncle Luyun head-on and not be at a disadvantage. Once he made up his mind to protect the emperor, he gathered all the strength in his body and did not hold anything back. He knew that when faced with Sir Wu, other than using all his strength in one spear strike, there was no other way to stop his seemingly staggering footsteps. With an explosive roar, a silver spear light as pure as water pierced toward Wu Zhu's back. Yi Zhong had unleashed the most powerful attack of his life. All of his spirit and spirit were focused on this attack, so he did not notice that the ascetic monk who had lightly floated back into the wind and rain seemed to be a little too close to his body. Ascetic monks never used weapons, but the ascetic monk closest to Yi Zhong had taken out a poison dagger from his sleeve at some point. Silently, like a strand of rain hidden in the rain, it gently pierced toward Yi Zhong's waist. Yi Zhong stabbed Wu Zhu's back, and the ascetic monk stabbed his waist. With a swoosh, Yi Zhong's spear strike, which he had gathered strength, pierced forward without any flourish. It ignored all resistance and pierced directly into the stone floor of the royal palace that had been washed clean by the rain. It was like piercing a piece of tofu. The tip of the spear stabbed ruthlessly into the ground, sinking several feet deep. However, the poison-black dagger had already pierced into his waist the moment his spear was fully unleashed. Yi Zhong's spear missed. It brushed past the cloth beside Wu Zhu's broken leg and pierced into the ground. Immediately after, a shrill roar rang out in the rain. He abandoned the spear and pulled back his palm, which landed on the ascetic monk's shoulder. Using the coffin breaker technique, the ascetic monk's shoulder immediately shattered. However, the ascetic monk did not make a sound or feel pain. Like an emotionless wooden man, he took the palm of Yi Zhong, a superior 9th-level ace. As blood sprayed wildly from his mouth, he pushed the dagger in his hand forward and completely broke through the defense of Yi Zhong's armor, heavily injuring his abdomen. A wave of energy exploded between the two of them, shaking the Qing military aces beside them to the ground. The two of them were like a large bird and its shadow, quickly flying off their horses and slamming into the rain. They broke through countless layers of rain and flew into the distance. Yi Zhong was crippled. At least for today the assassin was the shadow. When the ascetic monk silently hid from the eyes of the Qing aces present and used the rain to get close to Yi Zhong's back, Fan Xian, who had been watching everything in the dark, immediately sensed a strange atmosphere. This was an innate sensitivity of the people of the Overwatch Council. In the world, probably only he and the shadow could reach such a level. After Fan Xian entered the capital, he had not contacted the shadow because even he didn't know where the shadow had been hiding this year. However, he knew that the shadow would not be satisfied. The foremost assassin in the world would get revenge for Qin Pingping. Thus the palace was in chaos. Fan Xian knew that the shadow, who was somewhere, would certainly find an opportunity to attack. However, he had not thought that the shadow would be mixed in with the ascetic monks. A year ago, the two of them had fought a major battle with the ascetic monks. How the shadow had been able to mix in was something Fan Xian did not understand. However, at least at this moment, the shadow had successfully eliminated the foremost ace by the Qing Emperor's side and pulled the victory in their favor. If this had been any other mission in the past, it would have been the most important target in the mission for the shadow to attack. Even Fan Xian could not compete with him on this, just like the last attack when he entered the palace to assassinate Yi Zhong. However, the shadow had silently retreated and chosen Yi Zhong of his own accord because he had discovered that the first commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Sir Wu, had come. The shadow, who had viewed Wu Zhu as his idol, naturally chose to cooperate with Wu Zhu. This was actually a kind of trust. Fan Xian's gaze only swept over Yi Zhong and the shadow, who were breaking through the rain and endlessly charging away from the battlefield. He then turned back to the battlefield in front of Taiji Palace. The moment Yi Zhong was attacked, the people in front of Taiji Palace couldn't help but panic. The attacks aimed at Yi Zhong's immobile body also became slightly chaotic. The only one who did not panic was the emperor. He completely ignored the ascetic monk's attack. He only stared fixedly at Yi Zhong's hand. The emperor only had Wu Zhu in his eyes. The incomparably hard metal rod had already been bent, damaged and smoothed out. It looked like a very common fire stick. However, this fire stick carried the rain in front of Taiji Palace and waved it through the air to its heart's content. With a slap, the metal rod knocked aside a long spear in front of it. In the shortest amount of time, it followed the most logical direction and slammed into the wrist of the person holding the spear. In that instant, the skin on the wrist of the person holding the spear split open. His muscles shattered and his bones protruded. He could no longer hold the spear. With a crack, the metal rod slid up along the surface of a sword. The heavy pressure forced the sword to lower its head. The metal rod, which no longer had any edge, touched the protruding part of the sword. It suddenly jumped up and then landed heavily on the arm of the person holding the sword, directly turning the arm into twisted firewood. An ascetic monk waved his hand to block it. The metal rod, which had been ground into a flat surface, ruthlessly pierced into his palm, pressing his palm into the rain-covered ground. Then, the metal rod swung up and smashed heavily into the top of the ascetic monk's head. The bamboo hat, along with the rainwater, shattered into countless pieces. A mark formed by blood appeared on the ascetic monk's smooth head. With a crack he collapsed into the rainwater. Each swing of the metal rod was accurate and heavy. The metal rod, which had long lost its edge, became a metal stick in Wu Zhu's hand. It knocked aside the densely packed swords in front of him and shattered countless joints. Blood mixed with the rainwater and splashed into the air in front of him. The metal rod could no longer pierce into the throats of the countless aces in the royal palace, but it could shatter their throats. Wu Zhu, who advanced with difficulty in the rain, seemed to be able to fall at any moment. However, the ones who fell in the end were the aces bravely blocking in front of the emperor. At this moment, Wu Zhu seemed to have become the serious teacher on the cliff. Every time he swung his staff, it would accurately land on Fan Xian's body. No matter how Fan Xian tried to dodge, he would never be able to. But today the wooden staff had become an iron staff. With a muffled thud, the cartilage on an internal courtguard's knee was shattered by the metal rod. He knelt by Wu Zhu's side. The metal rod swung down again and smashed the person down the stone steps, sending up rainwater. Wu Zhu finally stood in front of the emperor. Without pausing, cursing, or making eye contact, Wu Zhu raised his hand. The metal rod in his hand smashed down toward the emperor's face. No one in the world dared to slap the emperor's face, but Wu Zhu did so. Furthermore, he did so as if it was a matter of course. It was as if he was teaching an unfilial son a lesson or beating a heartless man. When Wu Zhu stood in front of the emperor's eyes narrowed slightly. A certain light suddenly bloomed on his slightly aged face. Then he also raised his hand. In the instant that the rain did not even have time to tremble, the emperor's left hand, which had been hanging by his side the entire time, suddenly appeared by his face. His palm faced outward and blocked the metal rod. At the same time, the emperor's right hand formed a fist and smashed viciously into Wu Zhu's chest. His most terrifying pair of hands were as white as snow, seemingly forever untainted by dust and untainted by blood. They blocked Wu Zhu's metal drill and struck Wu Zhu's body. The first exchange between the last two ultimate warriors in the world, who had transcended the limits of humanity, was this simple. They each swung a stick, blocked a palm, and threw a punch. If it had been anyone other than the two of them, they would not have been able to block that metal rod and throw that punch. The emperor's terrifying fist smashed viciously into Wu Zhu's chest. The air seemed to have frozen at this moment. Wu Zhu's body seemed to be strangely suspended in the air at this moment. Then, like an arrow, he was fiercely smashed out. Like a heavy and hard meteorite, he flew out from the bottom of the stone steps. Wu Zhu's body smashed into countless pursuing Qing aces along the way. In front of Taiji Palace in the royal palace, where a black shadow passed, flesh and blood flew everywhere. With a muffled thud, Wu Zhu's body finally landed dozens of feet away. He landed heavily on the ground and shook the world around him. The entire place fell into a strange silence. At this moment, there weren't many people who were still alive and standing. Below Taiji Palace, on the stone steps, in the light rain, the lonely and proud emperor still maintained his posture with one palm in front of him and one fist extended in the air. Knocking Wu Zhu down with one punch was something worthy of the Qing emperor's pride. However, there was not a trace of emotion on his face. On the contrary, a glimmer of coldness appeared in his eyes. Wu Zhu's metal rod had shattered the powerful Jinqi the Qing emperor had attached to his palm and ruthlessly struck the Qing emperor's face. The Qing emperor's face was very pale, but his left cheek was red and swollen. Fresh blood flowed from the corner of his lips. It was like someone had slapped him heavily in the face. He slowly pulled back his left hand and lowered his head to look at the metal rod marks on his palm. Only then did he remember that Wu Zhu's metal rod was bent. Wu Zhu, in the puddle of blood and rain, suddenly moved. Then, with unusual difficulty, he stood up with his bent body. The metal rod in his hand trembled as it stood on the ground, supporting his tottering body as he stood in the rain. He had walked this far with incomparable difficulty. He had walked to the emperor's side only to be knocked back by a punch from the emperor. This was something that was enough to make anyone despair. However, Wu Zhu's expression did not change at all. He only dragged his even more broken left leg and, using an even more difficult posture and even slower speed, once again walked toward the bright yellow figure below Taiji Palace. Chapter 769. I am still writing the last chapter. If I finish it, it will be morning. If I fall asleep in front of the computer, it will be much later. Everyone, please don't wait. I am very satisfied with this chapter and countless other chapters. Everyone knows how satisfied I am. Perhaps you cannot agree because I cannot extravagantly ask for the satisfaction of all my friends. I only hope that everyone is satisfied with my satisfaction because this means that everyone is satisfied with my attitude in writing the book. Only something that I am satisfied with will I bring it up for everyone to see. So that is how it is. It is only so, but it is still so. Not bad. Thank you very much for being with me for so long. The day after tomorrow, I will write the epilogue and repeat it a few times. Please read it. The Qing Emperor's fist was always steady and powerful. It was full of the aura of a ruler. It easily pierced through all obstacles in front of it, just as he often did in this life. In the decades of history in this land, not many people had survived an attack from the Qing Emperor. Sigu Jian, that strange old creature, had his intestines torn apart and could only rely on Fei Jie's strange poison to struggle at death's door. However, Fan Xian had relied on the magic coup he had left behind to move dozens of feet in one move. Contrary to the Qing Emperor's expectations, he had forcefully avoided the terrifying power contained within the fist. Wu Zhu did not avoid this punch. He had truly withstood the boundless jinqi in the Qing Emperor's body. A part of his chest caved in, but he did not fall. If the highest realm in the world was a great grandmaster, then if the only weakness of a great grandmaster was that they were still like immortals, then Wu Zhu clearly did not have this weakness. His body was certainly the most powerful among the great grandmasters. He only stood up again and moved closer to the Qing Emperor on the wet ground. He once again walked in front of the Qing Emperor. The black cloth on his face did not move. The metal drill in his hand waved and broke through the air noiselessly. Because it was too fast, the people who were struggling to survive could not see what was happening on the stone steps or hear any sound. The Emperor did not retreat. A faint gray light flashed through his eyes. His feet stood steadily on the stone steps. Just as he had declared with boundless dominance and confidence in the Hanging Temple, he had never retreated half a step in his life, regardless of what enemy he faced. He punched again. His jade-like fist glowed with a faint light. In an instant, it evaporated all the moisture in the air and landed squarely on Wu Zhu's abdomen. Wu Zhu's metal rod was like a streak of clear light cast down from the sky. It could not be stopped. It struck ruthlessly against the Qing Emperor's left shoulder. 4 warriors of their realm, in the last battle of their lives, they had long cast aside all external pretense and techniques. In the word power, the power was already in their bodies and bearing. They collided purely with reality. It was just like what Master Ku He's great ancestor, Zhen Qin, had said in one of the sayings, "Take off your clothes and go." The duel between the two peerless experts was just the most indifferent and simple performance art. Without any external appearance, it was just like primitive people practicing the most perfect killing skills in the snow, beside the volcano, and in the midst of grassland beasts. The Emperor's left shoulder shattered with a crack. Fresh blood seeped out from between his lips. His cold eyes only watched Wu Zhu's figure flying further and further away. Wu Zhu was once again sent flying by that fist. His leg had been broken and his body was crippled. His unimaginably calculating ability could no longer be supported by the powerful execution of his body. He could not dodge the Qing Emperor's fist that broke through the boundaries of time and space. In the light rain that was about to stop, Wu Zhu's body arched as he retreated backward in the air. The cold wind caused his clothes to flutter. With a paw, his feet landed on the ground. He slid backward over 100 feet on the slippery ground before he managed to stop. However, his left leg couldn't support him and he almost fell to the ground. After taking this punch head-on, Wu Zhu did not fall to the ground. It seemed that his situation was better than before. However, the incomparable confidence and powerful light on the Emperor's face, as well as Wu Zhu's slightly lowered head, seemed to indicate an inauspicious ending. Wu Zhu stood quietly in the pool of blood below Taiji Palace. He lowered his head to look at his abdomen and was silent for a long time. Before the Emperor's fist struck his abdomen, Wu Zhu had blocked his left hand. Thus, the Emperor's fist had actually struck his palm and then his abdomen. Wu Zhu's hand was like an icy piece of metal. His body was also like an icy ball of metal. However, the Qing Emperor's fist was like a god's hammer, smashing the metal into the ball of metal. His palm had sunk deep into his abdomen like 2 pieces of metal being forcefully glued together. The corner of his brows that was not covered by the black cloth furrowed slightly. Coldly, Wu Zhu pulled at his left hand. He didn't know how much strength he used before he managed to pull his hand out from his abdomen. However, it brought up a large patch of pale flesh that was no longer bleeding. Accompanied by the sound of tearing, it appeared unusually terrifying. The Qing Emperor's first punch landed on Wu Zhu's chest. He didn't block it. The second punch landed on his abdomen. He did not block it. Two different choices represented two completely different levels of damage. It seemed that the vital points of the emissaries of the temple were no longer a secret in the eyes of that powerful ruler. This reality made Wu Zhu somewhat stunned. It also made the spectators, who were still enduring and shivering, begin to feel boundless fear. Propping the metal rod on the blood-soaked and rain-soaked ground, Wu Zhu used his left hand to straighten his almost broken left leg. With great difficulty he took a step toward Taiji Palace. His cloth shoe stepped on the hand of a corpse and almost slipped. A crisp crack rang out from Wu Zhu's abdomen. It was as if a spiderweb of cracks were spreading out and tearing through his body with that spot as the center. Wu Zhu's body began to tremble and tilt. It was as if he could become countless pieces at any moment, fall apart, and collapse into a pool on the ground. However, the metal drill rod was still tightly gripped in his hand, supporting his tottering body valiantly, allowing him to take another step forward. Even his first step was so difficult, so slow, accompanied by some extremely dry sounds. However, he still walked step by step towards the emperor without hesitation. The emperor pulled back his fist. His indifferent and emotionless eyes glanced at his chest. It was as if he wanted to count how many of his ribs had been shattered by that hard metal rod. He didn't remember how many punches he had thrown out or how much blood he had spat out. He only remembered that he didn't take a step back, but he didn't advance either. He just stood like a puppet on the stone steps in front of his palace and threw out his punches mechanically and repeatedly. How many times had the fifth prince fallen? How many times had he gotten up? How many times had he fallen in his life? How many times had he gotten up? Why was the fifth prince clearly about to fall, yet he struggled to get up? Did he not know that a monster like him would one day truly die? If the fifth prince was not a dead thing but a living thing, knew about life and death and feared it, then why didn't he show it? Why was it that the fifth prince's movements had clearly slowed down so much, yet the hard metal rod in his hand was always able to smash into his body? Was it because he was already old and was about to run out of oil? No, it couldn't be. It shouldn't be. Dissatisfaction and indignation burned faintly in his cold eyes. In the end, it turned into endless tiredness and boredom. Was this a shocking battle destined to be recorded in the annals of history or a small show destined to disappear in the long river of history? Regardless of which it was, the Qing Emperor was tired of it. It was just like how many years after his father ascended the throne, he was forced to painfully prepare for the matter of Taiping Courtyard. A few years later there was going to be a night of blood in Jingdo. The Great Dong Mountain lured and killed those two old things. And Ji lured and killed those shameless people who dared to betray him in Jingdo. Last year he wanted to lure the chest out. Now the fifth prince was here. Endless schemes and plots were like the fifth prince in front of him falling and rising again. They repeated endlessly. It was like a story from many years ago, stubbornly replayed over and over again. This kind of repetition was truly annoying and tiresome. However, the Qing Emperor could not be tired. He was not willing to be tired. He still had many things to do. He had not defeated the most powerful enemy in front of him. He could not let go. Slowly wiping away the blood that gushed endlessly from the corners of his lips, the emperor suddenly felt his body grow slightly cold. A year ago he had been heavily injured and had not recovered. At times he was afraid of the cold, light and wind. Thus, he was willing to lie on the soft couch and cover himself with the silk blanket Wanner had brought from Jiangnan. He liked that warm feeling and didn't like this cold feeling. It made him feel powerless and tired. It seemed that as the blood flowed away, the temperature and confidence in his body also flowed away. Looking at Wu Zhu, who had once again climbed to his feet, the broken Wu Zhu, the emperor's burning eyes suddenly lit up. Following the sudden paleness, his old face appeared unusually thin and sallow. The rain had stopped. The dark clouds in the sky were turning into white clouds at a speed visible to the naked eye. They grew whiter and whiter, more and more beautiful and brighter. The air in the square of the royal palace was filled with the beautiful aura of rain washing the blue sky. Beyond the palace walls, in the extreme eastern skyline, something beautiful was faintly happening. The emperor opened his hazy eyes. With a shake of his clothes, he finally flew up from the stone steps of Taiji Palace. In this rainless sky, he brought up a stream of rain parallel to the south, leaving behind countless afterimages in the air. The blue sky reflected this dragon of rain. A draconic cry seemed to ring out from somewhere in the royal palace. Wu Zhu, who was holding the metal drill, was immediately surrounded by this dragon and countless draconic cries. The gray, solemn and beautiful rainwater that broke through the air instantly launched its most powerful attack toward Wu Zhu. Other than the two powerful warriors present, no one could see clearly what was happening in that curtain of rain. However, the dragon's cry had died out. After a terrifying moment of absolute silence, countless sounds rang out one after another like a string of thunder. It was also like the wind high up in the sky instantly blowing through the yellow paper lanterns put out by countless lovers. Pa 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 pa. Wu Zhu finally fell. He fell under the Qing Emperor's storm-like punches and fingers. In this instant, his body had suffered countless heavy blows. Finally, he sat down weakly at the Qing Emperor's feet. His pale right hand opened toward the sky. There was nothing there. The long, silent and noble head also drooped down powerlessly and fell in front of the Qing Emperor. Reluctantly and helplessly, he let go of the hand holding the metal drill. But the metal drill did not fall to the ground of the royal palace. It made the clear sound of a funeral bell because the metal drill was stuck in the Qing Emperor's abdomen and was trembling slightly. Fresh blood surged out of the Qing Emperor's abdomen and flowed down the metal drill. It dripped down the smooth tip of the drill and landed on Wu Zhu's pale palm. Following a clear line of life, it gradually bloomed into a beautiful peach blossom. The Emperor's thin and emotionless lips were slightly parted. They appeared slightly dry. His face was deathly pale. His eyes were empty and without a trace of emotion. He lowered his head to look at the metal drill in his abdomen. Feeling boundless exhaustion and annoyance, he prepared to pull out the metal drill that had sunk deep into his abdomen. He was the person with the greatest willpower in the world. At the beginning, his meridians had all been shattered. Even the pain of being a cripple could not weaken his spirit at all, much less the pain in his abdomen. He knew that Lao Wu was already crippled. A faint pride flashed through his eyes, but there was only boundless exhaustion. He discovered that his lips were beginning to taste something rusty. Fan Xian still had not appeared. This reality confused the emperor. A glimmer of a self-mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. It looked like his son's state of mind was stronger than he had imagined. Because of his strength, he had been cold, callous and cold-blooded, enduring silently until now. He had watched as Wu Zhu was crippled by him but still refused to come out. Strangely, the emperor once again felt admiration for his son. He seemed to feel that his most unfilial son was becoming more and more like himself, as cold-blooded as himself. He had thought that Fan Xian should have come out a long time ago. When Wu Zhu first fell to the ground, or when Wu Zhu's leg was broken in two, he had been secretly preparing for this. However, Fan Xian had not come out, so he felt a faint disappointment and an ominous feeling. Was the blue sky after the rain going to witness the emperor's final failure? Was she going to use her son's eyes to see his failure? Fresh blood surged out from the powerful emperor's lips and from his abdomen. He once again felt the coldness and began to think of the soft blanket on the couch and the woman in the royal study. Then, his right hand gripped the metal drill steadily and began to slowly pull it out of his body with a heart-shaking coldness. There was an old saying that when a blade was pulled out of a wound, the pain was the greatest. This could be used to refer to life, but it could also be used to refer to the current situation. When the emperor slowly pulled out the metal drill, it was like exposing the scars that had been hidden in the darkness by his mask all these years. The scars that he thought had long healed made him think of many people and many things. The pain made his pale face even whiter, so white that it was not like a normal person's. It seemed like even this monarch's arm couldn't bear to let him face this kind of pain. Therefore, at this moment in the cold and clean air, an extremely strange twist suddenly occurred. It was a twist and separation of bone and flesh. It did not conform to the structure of the human body at all. It bent out at a strange angle. It was rather like Wu Zhu's leg. Blood blossomed under the blue sky. Bone and flesh separated from the Qing Emperor's body. His left arm was neatly cut off from the elbow joint by a mysterious force. Under the light of the clear sunlight, the severed arm flew into the spotless air. With the slowest speed it spun, jumped, danced with beads of blood at the stump. Only then did the clear sound of a gunshot echo through the empty royal palace courtyard. It curled up in spirals and was lonely and clear. It was like a sorrowful accompaniment to the dancing of the severed arm. Other than losing to Zhang Qingfeng on the northern expedition, the meridians in his body shattered, and the days when he sank into darkness. This moment was the most painful and weakest moment of the emperor's life. The gunshot, which had been silent for decades and then silent for another year, finally rang out in the royal palace. After a year of silence and another morning of silence, Fan Xian's figure finally appeared by the emperor's side. Watching as Wu Zhu was heavily injured by the emperor until he became useless, Fan Xian still did not come out. What kind of pain was he suppressing? However, when he appeared, he chose the most opportune moment and appeared in the most opportune place. He appeared directly beside the emperor. All he needed was the snap of a finger. His 20-odd years of bitter cultivation after being reborn, his motivation between life and death on the meadow, his will to not despair in the desperate situation in the snowy palace, his comprehension under the tree, his thoughts in the snowy plains, the creation of the Yuanqi of heaven and earth, life and death, separation and separation, the clash between weak and valiant, a life of craving life and hating death, and the pain of the autumn rain all merged into one feeling. An aura exploded out of Fan Xian's body. There was no sword, no arrow, no dagger, no poisonous smoke, no small tricks, no coffin breaker, no stretching out of his arm against the path of the sword, and no channeling of his qi against the path of heaven and earth. Fan Xian abandoned everything. He only turned himself into a gust of wind and a streak of gray light. In the shortest of moments, he forced out all of his power through his fingers and chopped toward the emperor's heavily injured and weak body. The powerful tyrannical Jinchi did not hesitate to cut the already thick meridians in his body. With a decisive stance and a speed beyond his ability, it fiercely sent out. Countless streaks of smoke and dust lit up the cold autumn. He sent it to his fingers. The Jinchi did not spit it out. Instead, it gathered it inside. The sword qi did not leave his fingers, but it was as solid as metal and stone. Viciously, it pierced into the emperor's shoulder. Moving it to his palm, the Jinchi was like the wind of the East Sea. It surged out violently and swept through the clean jade mountain. Without leaving a single speck of dust, it slammed heavily into the emperor's chest. Chopping finger and palm, he chopped away the past of these years. He pointed out a path of life and death. With a single palm, he separated the line between ruler and official, father and son. Fan Xian had never been so powerful in his life. The Qing emperor had never been so weak. This pair of father and son didn't even have time to meet each other's eyes for an instant before they became two shadows in front of Taiji Palace. They made the intimacy of life and death with each other. It was as if countless yellow paper lanterns in the air had been torn apart by the strong wind. They popped endlessly, causing one's heart to palpitate with boredom. The speed of Fan Xian's movements had already risen to a level that would make people dumbfounded. He did not leave any afterimages. There was only a wisp of gray shadow that circled around the emperor's body. In an instant he had attacked dozens or hundreds of times. The rainwater that had accumulated on the stone floor suddenly seemed to have been split open by a water-repellent bead. It spread to the sides, revealing the clean stone tiles in the middle. About half a palm's length above the stone tiles, the emperor and Fan Xian's figures flew through the air. In an instant they left the front of Taiji Palace and flew like lightning toward the northeast. Water splashed everywhere along the way. A trail of blood flew through the air in a line. With a bang, the bright yellow figure dispiritedly smashed through the palace doors between the walls of the royal palace, shattering the thick palace doors and filling the air with wood shavings. The wood shavings shot out in all directions like powerful arrows. With a series of sizzling sounds, they shot through the circular stone doors behind the palace doors and sent up a wave of stone shavings. They embedded deeply into the vermilion palace walls. It was the wood shavings shooting out from all directions beside the bright yellow figure that forced Fan Xian, who was like a soul-chasing wind and soul-chasing shadow, to slow down and reveal his body in the air. The bright yellow figure smashed through the palace doors and immediately after, he crashed heavily into the large copper water vat between the walls. With a muffled sound he also revealed his body. The hand that was still not stained with blood broke through the air, and with a "pa" sound, a slender wrist was shaken off. Like lightning he pulled out the ice-cold metal, flipped his wrist up and pinched that soft throat. Then it gripped the serving girl's throat. With a splat, the emperor leaned dejectedly and weakly against the side of the large copper vat and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. However, a faint and strange smile rose to his pale face. One of his arms was already broken. There were 4 or 5 finger holes and 3 palm prints on his body. Fresh blood dyed the dragon robe on his body, making the golden dragon on his bright yellow clothes appear particularly ferocious but also particularly wretched. Fan Xian slowly put down the bridge of his left hand and right fist that covered his face. The wood shavings also caused blood to seep endlessly out of his clothes. He coughed violently and coughed up threads of blood. The attack earlier was an attack that he had condensed his life into. At this moment he was forced to stop. It was already impossible for him to unleash that mysterious speed. Furthermore, a large portion of his meridians had been cut. They were like countless little knives scraping through his body. The pain was difficult to endure. The Emperor's injuries were even more serious. It was so serious that it seemed like he could disappear from this world at any moment. However, there was not a glimmer of joy on Fan Xian's face. After a series of hurried coughs, his expression recovered its calm. Looking at the Emperor, who was leaning against the copper vat and gasping for breath, he didn't say a word. However, his eyes revealed his true emotions. They were complicated. He stared at the Emperor in a daze. He kept feeling that the scene in front of him was not real. The Emperor, who was as high and unreachable as a snowy mountain, bone-chilling and powerful and indestructible, would also have a time when he was at the end of his rope? When did the Emperor's appearance become so old? Your Majesty, you've lost. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and used the sleeve of his eunuch robe to wipe away the blood at the corner of his lips. He looked at the Emperor with a complicated gaze. The words he said were meaningless. There were at least a dozen wounds on the Qing Emperor's body, particularly the cut on his left arm and the wound on his abdomen. Fresh blood gushed out endlessly. Just as the Emperor had said to Wu Zhu earlier, there were no immortals in this world. Wu Zhu was not, and neither was he. The betrayal, assassination, and injuries he had suffered this year had dragged on until now. Now he had fought a heaven-shaking battle with Wu Zhu, had his arm cut off by the heavy sniper rifle, and had been ambushed by Fan Xian, who was faintly breaking through. Even the most powerful ruler in the world had reached his final moments. A glimmer of a mocking and cold smile still hung on the Emperor's face. His 3 fingers continued to gently rest on the serving girl's throat. The serving girl held a gun in her hand. The Emperor glanced at Fan Xian but did not pay attention to his words. Instead, in a raspy voice and coughing up blood, he looked at Fan Ruoruo beside him with a warm gaze. After looking calmly for a long time, he said, "As I said, it is not easy to be a good emperor. First, you have to abandon some unnecessary emotions and cannot be soft-hearted. Ruoruo, you are soft-hearted today. This is a fatal mistake." The face of the young lady of the Fan family, dressed in serving girl attire, remained calm. However, her slightly furrowed brows showed that her heart was not as calm as her appearance. Since last autumn, she had been taken into the royal palace by the Emperor. She had always accompanied this lonely ruler in the royal study. Day after day she had seen too many times the thin figure reading memorials under the oil lamp, heard too many coughs coming from the sickbed, and seen too many times the thin old man's furrowed brows. Gradually, on the 8th day of the new year, on a snowy day, she had been in Jiaxing Tower, looking through the glass at the bright yellow figure in the distance. She had always felt that it was unreal, so her fingers had not trembled in the slightest. Now, through the crack in the palace doors, looking at the gradually aging and familiar face of the Emperor, for some reason, she had chosen to aim at the Emperor's arm and not at a fatal point. The Emperor was right. In that instant, Fan Ruoruo's heart softened a little. Girls are extroverted. Qin girl has tried endlessly to soften my resolve this year, but I ignored it. You like that scoundrel in Ji, I know that. However, have you girls ever thought about whether, in this year, you have softened me or been softened by me? The Emperor spoke calmly and indifferently. He did not summon the internal court eunuchs he had exiled to the back palace. He also did not stop the bleeding. It was as if he did not care at all about the blood flowing out of his body. A slightly mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. Fan Ruoruo's body trembled slightly. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the Emperor in front of him, who was both familiar and strange and had a complicated relationship with him. He didn't know what kind of shock rose in his mind. His admiration for the Emperor's willpower and scheming reached a peak. In such a dangerous moment earlier, the Emperor had appeared defeated under his desperate attack. In reality, he had still chosen the best path. He had broken through the palace doors, found the person holding the spear, and taken control of her. Fan Xian pressed his thin lips together tightly. Suddenly, he gritted his teeth and said, "Your Majesty, don't try to use her life to threaten me. You will accept my threat?" The Emperor asked in a mocking tone as he slowly turned his head and allowed the blood to soak into his dragon robe. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then shook his head. Looking at Fan Ruoruo, he said in a raspy voice, "If you die, I will accompany you." Fan Ruoruo's face was slightly pale. After a moment of silence she said, "Sister, you are not afraid of death." Is escaping the fear of life and death something remarkable? The emperor stared into Fan Xian's eyes and suddenly laughed softly. Your face is like your mother's, but your lips are a bit like mine. Extremely thin and heartless. It is indeed true. A moment later, the indifferent emperor suddenly said, In my life, I have never lost. For some reason, after Fan Xian was reborn, he always possessed a calmness, even coldness, that normal people did not have. However, at such a tense moment, when he heard the emperor's words, a sliver of sourness, emptiness, and anger welled up from the depths of his heart. In a cold voice, he roared loudly at the emperor, Enough! The emperor looked calmly into his son's eyes. He looked at his handsome face that was slightly twisted in anger. Suddenly he laughed coldly. It was as if he was laughing at the other party's loss of composure, the other party's fear, and the strange anger that came from nowhere. In the empty royal palace, other than the rainwater still accumulating on the ground and the countless corpses and flesh, there were only 4 people left standing. Fan Xian stood by Uncle Wu Zhu's side and stared coldly at the bright yellow figure not far away. No one knew what he was thinking. He was indeed afraid, but the anger was not born out of fear. Instead, it was born out of another sense of sorrow. From there to here, the distance was very short. Fan Xian seemed to have an opportunity to attack. However, the emperor was within 3 feet of Fan Ruoruo's side. No one dared to take such a risk in front of a great grandmaster. Fan Ruoruo still held that heavy sniper rifle in her hand. Everyone could see that the emperor was at the end of his rope and was on the verge of death. I have never lost in my life. The emperor looked at the sun in front of him and Wu Zhu in front of him. He slowly raised his sleeve to wipe away the blood at the corner of his lips. Coldly he said, I just feel as if I am going to die. Failure and death were 2 different concepts. Failure was victory and defeat, but life and death often belonged to fate. A ruler's failure would certainly lead to his death. A ruler's death was not necessarily because he had failed. Perhaps the Qing emperor was already surrounded by the aura of death, but he had not failed. His death had actually been predestined a long time ago. There was no true path of kings in the world. The emperor's body had been disturbed by ruthless Jinshi these years, making it impossible for him to rest. The many things that had happened this year had allowed the Jinshi to find a way to harm him in his body. It quickly destroyed his life force and sped up the process of his aging. However, the emperor's slightly sunken eyes looked coldly at Fan Xian. He did not lightly speak of the truth that was destined to shock him endlessly. Even if I die, I will kill you, unfilial son. The emperor coughed, making him bend slightly. There was a faint unwillingness in his coughs. The Li family's kingdom is destined to unify the world. As long as you die, regardless of which of my 2 sons takes the throne, the world will still belong to the Qing kingdom. The raging flames of war outside Nanjing were only flames that forced Fan Xian to appear. Otherwise, if Fan Xian returned from the temple and went into hiding, where would the Qing emperor go to find him? However, if Fan Xian did not die, the great work of the Qing kingdom for thousands of generations would not appear. Even if the Qing emperor knew that his body was about to weaken, how could he be at ease? The situation today was just a ruler wanting to kill his official and a father wanting to kill his son. Who would have thought that the situation would change in the royal palace? In the lonely royal palace, the emperor faced all of the enmity alone. The emperor felt a bit tired. He looked at Fan Xian calmly and suddenly realized that the desire to kill his son was not as strong as he had imagined. Why was this? Perhaps the source of the emperor's desire to kill was the anger he felt because of Fan Xian's betrayal and not for the Qing kingdom for thousands of generations. An emperor without meridians and a heartless person. Once he became angry because of disappointment and moved, he was nothing more than a mortal. The emperor suddenly felt that if he died like this, he would probably be very lonely. What kind of cold gaze would his relatives in the netherworld, Qingqian, Qingze, and the empress look at him? Would his mother be well in the netherworld? After that woman's death, would her spirit still look at him with that seemingly gentle but actually incomparably distant gaze? A sense of loneliness and desolation took over the old emperor's body. He suddenly realized that in the last battle of his life, he was still facing her spear, her servant, her and his son. After struggling for a lifetime, in the end he was still fighting her. Thinking of this, a glimmer of a sorrowful smile rose to the emperor's face. Was he destined to lose to her hands? The bright yellow figure shook slightly. The spear in Fan Ruoruo's hand was caught through the air by his uninjured hand. His fingers tightened slightly. The tyrannical Jinshi in the emperor's body burst forth like a river or an ocean. After a light sound, the barrel of the spear was forcefully bent. The emperor's Jinshi surged. His injuries worsened. He only narrowed his eyes and looked coldly at the scrap metal thrown at his feet. It was as if he was interrogating the woman. He didn't say anything for a long time. How good would it be if Lao Wu never stepped into the world again? The emperor lowered his head and suddenly sighed gently. Slowly raising his head, he looked at Wu Zhu, who was sitting on the ground and leaning against Fan Xian's leg. With great difficulty he shook his head. I can't remember many things. However, what has happened. One day he will remember what happened in the past and know something. He will come to kill me. The pale-faced emperor looked in a daze at Wu Zhu, who was dumb and speechless like a child. He tried to stand up but could not. Suddenly the emperor opened his mouth and said, Lao Wu, you've forgotten some things again. Truly, fortunate. When a powerful figure starts to become so naggy, does it mean that he is really old? Or was this the final radiance of a setting sun? Fan Xian looked in a daze at the one-armed emperor and suddenly felt an emptiness in his chest. He kept on feeling that everything that had happened today was too strange. It did not seem real at all. The light in the emperor's sunken eyes gradually dissipated. Looking at Fan Xian, he quietly said, It wasn't you. In the end, it was only your mother who won. He gazed at Fan Xian mockingly without a trace of dejection. On the contrary, he was very much like that incomparably powerful ruler from a few years ago. Mockingly he said, The seed of the Zhan family's little emperor is yours. You know what kind of person the third prince is? No matter what you do in the future, this world will always belong to the Li family. You once said that after you died, even if the flood reached the heavens, I would have to think about it. The emperor looked at Fan Xian. The smile at the corners of his lips grew wider and filled with mockery. Your mother is only trying to change the course of history, yet you vainly want to stop the course of history. What an arrogant and naive way of thinking. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly said, Actually, you and I in history are both unremarkable splashes. No, the history books will have a page for me. A cold and proud light flashed through the emperor's eyes. Fan Xian didn't say anything more. Only now did he realize that he had still underestimated this emperor. Nothing he said or did could be hidden from him. He even knew about the red bean rice in northern Qi. The scene was a pool of blood. Fan Xian didn't move. He didn't dare move. His sister was under the emperor's control. He didn't even know how to resolve the situation before him. He also didn't know whether the emperor's current weakness was an illusion or if he had truly seen through certain things when he was about to die. Fan Xian had an innate respect for the emperor. Even at this moment he still felt this way. He didn't know whether or not the imperial army outside the palace would break through the backup he had left behind and forcefully open the palace doors. He also didn't know how the Shadow and Yi Zhong were doing. He also didn't know why Eunuch Yao's group still hadn't appeared. What chilled him the most was whether the emperor's counterattack before his death would have Uncle Wu Zhu, his sister, and himself accompany him in death. Even now, he still believed that the emperor had this kind of power. The emperor raised his head with difficulty and narrowed his eyes slightly. Separated by the palace walls, he looked at the blue sky in the east. It was as if he had discovered that something beautiful was about to happen there. He gazed at the sky. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes trembled slightly. It was as if he had thought of something. His right hand, which was outside his long sleeves, curled slightly as if he wanted to hold on to something. The light in his eyes gradually gathered from the scattering. It was as if he wanted to see something clearly. Countless images flashed through his mind as if he wanted to remember something. No one knew the state of his body better than the Qing Emperor himself. Perhaps from the beginning of the snowy days on the 8th of the new year, he had foreseen that this day would come. This was not a debt repayment. It was fate. However, why did he still have such a powerful dissatisfaction in his heart? His extremely furrowed brows were like a question, endlessly asking a question to the blue sky that had been washed by the rain and appeared exceptionally clean. When he was young, he silently endured humiliation in a ruined manner. When he was young, he traveled the world with his friends and increased his knowledge. When he was young, he galloped across the grasslands in the white mountains and black waters, leading countless men to conquer a large territory. He pointed his sword at the world and wanted to conquer an even larger country. His intention was to last for thousands of generations. He wanted to leave his name in the annals of history. However, all of this had to stop here. How could he be satisfied? He still had many things that he had yet to do. If the Qing Emperor knew that these people, such as Yi Qingmei, Wu Zhu, and Fan Xian, were actually not people of this world, would he sigh with regret that the heavens wanted him dead and that it was not his fault for fighting? He was just thinking. If there was no that woman, there would not have been Lao Wu who had followed her into the world. There would not have been Ji. Perhaps there would not have been the palace treasury or many other things. Could he not have conquered this country himself? No, he could have done the same. At most, it would have been a little later. So what if he didn't have the nameless martial secret? Something like a great grandmaster who dared to oppose him should not have existed, should it not? However, if there was no Yi Qingmei, perhaps he would not have had those truly happy days in his life. The emperor's brows furrowed. He forgot about the life in his body and sank into this question. Fan Xian had once raised this question in the little building. It was not until now that the emperor truly asked him. Perhaps it was because he had never dared to ask himself this question in the decades that had passed. He withdrew his gaze and recovered his calm. The dying emperor still possessed an unparalleled might and will. He looked coldly at Fan Xian and Wu Zhu in front of him. It was as if he could use the last of his life to burn their lives away at any moment. There was a long silence. Fan Xian once again wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips and watched each of the emperor's movements nervously. Even he did not realize that not only were his thin lips very similar to the emperor's, but his action of wiping away blood was also very similar to the emperor's. The emperor suddenly smiled. The corners of his lips curled up strangely. He then gradually restrained his smile. Coldly he said, "Today I know what is in the chest. But there is one more thing I am very curious about in my life." He narrowed his eyes and gazed at Wu Zhu. Enunciating each word, he said, "I very much want to know what exactly is hidden behind this black cloth." The last target of the most powerful emperor in the world had chosen Wu Zhu and not Fan Xian. Perhaps it was because Fan Xian was his flesh and blood. Perhaps it was because he thought that Wu Zhu, an emissary of the temple that he hated, truly deserved to die. Perhaps it was because the Qing emperor had always believed that the matters of the world should always be resolved by the people of the world and should not have those dog-T gods interfere. Perhaps it was because the Qing emperor had discovered in that last moment that some of Fan Xian's indescribable actions were very similar to his own. In any case, his lightning-like hand split the air and attacked toward Wu Zhu's face while letting Fan Xian go. Fan Xian survived. In front of the emperor's last attack, his hand was shaken away like a leaf. It was completely unable to block it. He could only watch as the emperor's palm, mixed with the last bit of jinqi in his life, brushed viciously against Wu Zhu's face. With the emperor's brush, Wu Zhu's neck snapped abruptly and he fell backward. The black cloth fell. Time seemed to freeze in this moment. The piece of black cloth slowly floated down in the cool wind. A piece of black cloth covered the glass windows of the Overwatch Council to hide the piercing light of the royal palace. A piece of black cloth covered Wu Zhu's eyes to hide the sky. This piece of black cloth had been covered for countless years. It seemed that there would never be a day when it would be undone. For hundreds of years, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, it had always been like this. Today this piece of black cloth had fallen. Beneath the black cloth was a rainbow. A rainbow surged out from between Wu Zhu's delicate brows. It surged out from between his clear, lively, and perplexed eyes. In an instant, it lit up the square inside the royal palace and pierced through the bright yellow figure. The rainbow pierced through the Qing emperor's body and illuminated his incredulous expression. It then struck heavily against the palace of Taiji Palace and turned into a fire dragon, instantly igniting the entire palace. In just an instant, the emperor's expression suddenly became calm. Amidst this fire, he proudly straightened his body. Although he only had one arm, he straightened his body. In the instant before he left, a disdainful thought floated through his mind. So that was how it was. It was nothing more than this. It was still like this. Even in the instant of death, the most powerful person in the world would still leave behind an extremely powerful back. In this warm rainbow, this back appeared particularly cold and severe, silent, bleak, lonely, and unusually proud. The flying ash gradually fell. It was like the shrapnel of firecrackers used to offer sacrifices to the impermanence of the mortal world, spreading in the pool of blood in the square in front of the palace. At the same time, across the eastern sky of the palace walls, a rainbow finally appeared after the rain in the place where one always felt beautiful things would happen, overlooking the entire world. Night fell. The raging fire in Taiji Palace had already been put out. Fortunately, the rain had wet the ground. Otherwise, this fire would probably have burned the entire Qing royal palace into ruins. Not long after the strange rainbow appeared, the closed main gates of the royal palace were forcefully broken through by the court's army. No one could hide the news of the emperor's death. Even now, the mournful and incomparably angry people were still unable to find the emperor's remains. The person who assassinated the emperor was not a northern Qi assassin. It was the most heinous and unpardonable rebel in Qing history, Fan Xian. The court confirmed this news at the first moment. If it were not for the fact that the scholar and the heavily injured but not dead Yi Zhong had forcefully suppressed the grief and anger in Jingdo, perhaps in this night, many of the manors in Duke's Alley and Fan Manor would have been burned to the ground. The people inside would have no chance of survival. Other than the scholar and Yi Zhong, the person who truly controlled the situation was the third prince, Li Qingping, who had ascended to the throne at the risk of the country. Under the powerful control of the Qing emperor, the situation in Jingdo did not go out of control. Of course, no one knew exactly what role the old Overwatch Council and other hidden powers had played. Unexpectedly, the criminal Fan Xian, who was once again wanted by the court and had a shocking reward, had appeared in a place no one would have expected. He was still in the royal palace. Under the cover of the night, he withdrew his gaze from Taiji Palace and walked in the little building that was even more deserted than the cold palace. Taiji Palace had already been burned, and the little building had long been reduced to ashes. He walked among the knee-deep grass with his head slightly lowered. No one knew why he had come. Or was he just here to tell Yi Qingmei everything that had happened today? Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly as he looked at the person who had appeared beside the ruins of the little building. He tilted his head slightly as if he had not expected it. The person who had appeared was Eunuch Yao. He expressionlessly walked in front of Fan Xian and handed over a small box. In a low, raspy voice he said, "This is what the emperor left for you." Fan Xian accepted the box woodenly and watched Eunuch Yao disappear into the night. He was not worried that he would summon aces to surround and attack him. Outside the palace was one world and inside the palace was another. In this world inside the palace, presumably no one would want to harm him. Even if someone wanted to, it would not be at this moment. What had the emperor left for him? Why did he leave it? Had he known beforehand that he would not be able to survive today's ordeal? Fan Xian stared in a daze at the box in his hand. Only now did he understand why Eunuch Yao had not been by the emperor's side earlier. The emperor had given him a strange mission. Opening the box, there was a piece of white silk and a thin letter. Fan Xian's body froze slightly. He immediately recognized what it was. This was one of the 3 things he had seen under the Empress Dowager's phoenix bed when he had entered the royal palace at night. He had long copied one of the keys and successfully opened the box. The white silk and this letter were the other 2. 4 years ago, when the eldest princess was rebelling in Jingdo, Fan Xian had once tried to find these 2 things again. In the end he found that they were no longer in Hongguang Palace. Thinking about it now, the emperor must have placed them somewhere else. Later, the emperor knew that the key was in his hands, so he had only left this letter and this piece of white silk for him. Fan Xian used the tip of his finger to gently rub the surface of the white silk. Calming himself, he opened the unsealed letter and looked at it closely. Gradually, his brows furrowed and then relaxed. This was a letter Yi Qingmei had written to the Qing emperor. From the contents of the letter he knew what the white silk was. This was the white silk the Empress Dowager had given to the witch Yi Qingmei to use to commit suicide. After Yi Qingmei received the edict in Taiping courtyard, she had sent this white silk, untouched, back to the palace and delivered it to the Empress Dowager's bed. Presumably, only Uncle Wu Zhu could do such a thing. Presumably, the Empress Dowager had been terrified that day, so she had kept this white silk to deepen her hatred toward Yi Qingmei, that witch. Other than narrating this matter with a mischievous and smiling tone to express her strong displeasure, there was nothing else worth paying attention to in Yi Qingmei's letter. It was just family gossip, how Wu Zhu was and how Fan Jian was in the brothel. Paired with the clumsy and stiff handwriting, it was truly unbearable to look at. Fortunately, there were only 2 thin pages. Fan Xian increasingly didn't understand why the emperor would treasure this letter so much to the extent that he would leave it for him. Was he wrong earlier? Regardless of whether it was the white silk, the key, or this letter, they were all hidden by the emperor in Hongguang Palace and not by the Empress Dowager? He shook his head and stopped thinking about these questions that were destined to be buried in his memories and that no one knew the answer to. Immediately after, he noticed the handwriting on the back of the second piece of paper. The handwriting was strong and forceful, but it controlled emotion. It was written with particular order. It was clearly the emperor's handwriting. Fan Xian looked at it carefully. After looking at it for a long time, he sighed gently. His hands tightened. Unconsciously, he wanted to destroy the letter. Then he carefully stuffed the paper back into the envelope and tucked it away in his clothes. I was not wrong. These were the last words the Qing emperor had left at the back of the letter. It appeared to be an unusually powerful and proud declaration. However, for it to be a declaration to a woman who had passed away, it could only be a faint self-questioning. No one could answer this question. Other than history, no, even those history books that spoke with certainty would probably not be able to judge the merits and demerits of the emperor's life. It originated from Yi Qingmei and Qin Pingping. He only had hatred toward the emperor. However, his relationship with the emperor was not as simple as blood. The soul in his body could not acknowledge the blood connection, but he could not shake off the things that had happened over the years. This kind of emotion was extremely complicated. It could not be expressed in words. The emperor had died. Even now, Fan Xian still felt numb and cold from his body to his heart. He didn't dare believe this reality. He had always felt that man was the most powerful person in the world and the most impossible to defeat. How could he have died? He seemed to be somewhat relieved, but he did not feel the joy of revenge. He seemed to be sorrowful, but he could not cry no matter what. He could only stand numbly in the cold wind. From the letter, one could see that there was no true path of the emperor in the world. The emperor's body had already failed this year. Even if it was as Yi Qingmei had said, letting each person become their own king was not the path of the emperor. Fan Xian and the beliefs he held onto were even less so. Just as he had said to His Majesty on that snowy night, all he wanted was peace of mind and to settle a personal grudge. It did not involve the question of whether it was right or wrong. It should be known that humans were not a species that pursued the correct path. Being right was not justice because justice always had a stance. He suddenly thought of Yi Qingmei's memorials and letters that King Jing had treasured. He thought of how Yi Qingmei's letters to the emperor always talked about the world and the people's lives. There was only one letter with such a normal tone like today. Perhaps it was because of this that the emperor treasured it so much. Thinking of this, a bitter smile rose involuntarily to the corners of his lips. The emperor and Yi Qingmei were, without question, first-class romantic figures in the world. They were unspeakably beautiful. However, it was not a happy thing for the two of them to meet. For the emperor to meet a woman like Yi Qingmei was also a kind of pain. However, for Yi Qingmei to meet the Qing emperor was even more indescribably sorrowful. Fan Xian stood woodenly in the night palace among the long grass, looking at the remains of the little building in a daze. Even now he still didn't know where Yi Qingmei was buried. Now that he knew what his father had said back then, it was only a kind of comfort. The yellow-clothed woman in the painting in the little building had already turned to dust and gone with the wind. The emperor had also turned to dust and gone with the wind. Perhaps, in some corner of the world they would meet again. Chapter 770. Yesterday there were many brothers and sisters who stayed up all night with me. There was a kind of strength in my heart. At 9 in the morning I really couldn't stay up and went to sleep. In the end I slept until 5 or 6 in the afternoon. At this moment I sincerely offer up the last chapter of the Qingyu year. There are 11,000 words in total. It is not charged and is free because I want to share this last feeling with everyone. The epilogue will also follow. It will probably be within 2 days. Licking my lips, it is truly indescribably moving. A long time later in the spring. In the beautiful city of Hangzhou, a young man was riding on a big green horse. Behind him were many servants and guards, and the formation was quite grand. The young man walked along the weeping willow bank of West Lake. Occasionally, he would raise his hand to push aside the willow branches in front of him. There was a smile on his face, but he did not pretend to be at ease. On the contrary, he exuded a sense of scholarly nobility and an indescribable sense of freedom. Occasionally, pleasure boats passed by on the lake, but there were no beautiful women waving their red sleeves like in the rumors. Beside the young man, a person who looked like a housekeeper laughed in a high voice and said, "Everyone says that there are many beauties in West Lake. How come I don't see any?" The young man on the green horse furrowed his brows slightly. He probably felt that the housekeeper's words were too beneath his status. On another horse, a person who looked like an ace coldly said, "Baoyue brothel has opened all over the world, but there are people who fish in West Lake every day. Who would dare to make a living in West Lake?" These words were spoken somewhat strangely and carried a glimmer of coldness that could not be suppressed. The Qin kingdom was still the most powerful country in the world. Although the Overwatch Council in Jingdo had been reformed and even the position of director had been removed, the emperor's supervision of officials had reached an unprecedentedly strict level. Relying on the abundance of the national treasury and the methods of a certain predecessor, he had greatly increased the salaries of officials. Although the matter of running amok in the countryside could not be completely stopped, in a place as romantic as Hangzhou, would anyone dare to take over all of West Lake? The young man on the green horse furrowed his brows slightly and looked at the commoners in the distance moving out of their way. He paid attention to their clothing and expressions and turned his attention elsewhere. A few years ago the Qing Emperor was on an expedition to the north. Unexpectedly, just as war was about to break out, a startling change happened in the royal palace in Jingdo. The Qing rebel Fan Xian entered the palace to assassinate the emperor. Unfortunately, the emperor died. Once this news came out, the world was shocked. The country was thrown into turmoil. The Qing Iron Riders, who had already attacked the walls of Nanjing, had no choice but to retreat. They let go of the delicacy they had already swallowed. However, they still occupied a large piece of northern Qi territory. The matter of the Qing kingdom's northern expedition was delayed. After the new emperor cleaned up the court, cultivated trusted aides, and regained the confidence of the Qing people, the northern expedition was still not brought to the table. It felt like it would drag on forever. However, northern Qi did not let down its guard because of the unrest in the south. Under the careful governance of the Zhan family emperor, the northern Qi kingdom prospered and prospered. The strength of the country was gradually recovering. If this stalemate continued, the Qing kingdom's next northern expedition would probably become particularly difficult. Everyone who knew about the details of the assassination that shocked the entire world, including the Qing court, kept it a secret. They only used the fastest speed to nail Fan Xian to the pillar of shame. No one had any doubts about this. After all, the present emperor was the emperor's own son. Although everyone knew that the emperor and Fan Xian had a brotherly and teacher-student relationship, it was impossible for him to let go of the hatred of his father's death. What everyone found strange was why the Qing court did not tie this shocking matter to northern Qi or Dongyi. Instead, they used the anger of the nation to directly carry out the northern expedition to the end. Instead, whether intentionally or not, they removed northern Qi and Dongyi from this matter. No one knew that the young man on the green horse was the present emperor of the Qing kingdom. Naturally, no one recognized that the ace accompanying him was the foremost ace of the Qing kingdom, the deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Yi Wan. If the northern Qi learned of this news and knew that the Qing emperor and Yi Wan had appeared at the same time in Hangzhou, far from Jingdo, they would probably send out a large number of assassins to try their luck. After all, if the Qing emperor and Yi Wan died at the same time, the Qing kingdom's strength would probably be halved. The present Qing emperor was the third prince, Li Qingping, born of the previous emperor and imperial consort Yi. Since he dared to leave Jingdo and come to Hangzhou for a walk in the spring, he was not worried about these safety issues. Yi Wan beside him was a rare 9th-level ace. No one knew how many palace aces were hidden around him. Most importantly, Li Qingping did not believe there was anyone in this world who could harm him by the side of West Lake. A dozen years ago, in the 6th year of the Qing calendar, I stayed in Jiangnan for an entire year. Li Qingping sat on the green horse and gazed at the gentle ripples on the surface of West Lake. His gaze also became gentle. Although I stayed in Suzhou's Hua Garden for a long time, I also lived in the manor by West Lake for a while. Thinking about it now, it was the most relaxed days of my life. Your Majesty shoulders the peace of the world and the hopes of tens of thousands of people. Naturally, you cannot be as relaxed and happy as you were in your youth, Yi Wan said without much emotion. The two of them were by the willow bank of West Lake. Around them were people from the palace. Passers-by all stayed far away, so there was no need to avoid the conversation between ruler and official. Li Qingping listened to Yi Wan's old-fashioned, arrogant and hidden words of advice. He smiled slightly and did not reveal any feelings of loathing. First, he respected Yi Wan's loyalty to him. Second, Yi Wan had once been his martial tutor. Even now, Li Qingping only saw the man he had not seen for a long time as his only teacher. A group of people slowly advanced along the beautiful willow bank of West Lake toward the mountain, breaking the peace that had been maintained for many days. They came to an elegant courtyard with gray walls and black eaves. I haven't been here for many years, but this courtyard hasn't changed much. Li Qingping dismounted his horse with a calm expression. The door to the courtyard had long been opened, ready to welcome the emperor's incognito arrival. Standing in front of the courtyard with the door wide open that still had an impression of, the Qing emperor tidied his clothes and stepped in. The courtyard beside West Lake faced the water and had its back to the mountain. The back was quiet and secluded, but it did not have much of the dampness of the mountain. The lake water and the gentle wind passed through the forest and into the courtyard, making the voice in the study at the back of the courtyard become very gentle. Sir, I have completely lost your secret support these years. Sir, there is something I do not understand. Sir. The person called Sir by the Qing Emperor was silent for a long time and still didn't speak. It was not until a long time later that the voice rang out quietly, "Since your majesty has come, then rest a bit more at West Lake. The scenery in Jiangnan is good and the weather is good. It is better than Jingdo's hot summers and cold winters." Li Qingping's voice was also silent for a long time. It carried a slight hidden bitterness. Slowly he said, "Sir, in the end I am the son of a country. Your Majesty, I am well aware of this matter. However, I have long ceased to be an official of the Qing kingdom, am I not? Sir, regarding the matter of the palace treasury, you still have to give the court an explanation. Now that the Overwatch Council has found the whereabouts of that village, as the Emperor, I cannot pretend to be deaf and mute. Your Majesty, if there is any official who is angry about this matter, there is no harm in having them come find me. I don't mind letting them know exactly what this palace treasury is." The conversation stopped here and reached an impasse. The side of the study facing the courtyard had an open window pierced through by glass. Fan Xian sat beside the bright table under the window and moved his gaze away from Li Qingping's face. Narrowing his eyes slightly, he looked toward the peach blossom tree in the courtyard. A number of years had already passed. He had also disappeared from the world for a number of years. He had even disappeared from the discussions in the tea shops and alleys. Without a doubt, many people had already forgotten the Qing kingdom's immortal poet, powerful official and final rebel. His appearance had not changed much. A number of years was not enough to add the color of wind and frost to his brows and hair. It was still the same as before. However, his expression was increasingly calm and unruffled, calm and unmoving. Li Qingping glanced at him and slowly raised the teacup in his hand. Taking a shallow sip, he did not purposely hide the worry between his brows. Yi Wan, who had been standing by his side the entire time, narrowed his eyes and looked at the person who looked like Tian Jiaoweng. His brows gradually furrowed. It had been many years since he had seen this person. Although he secretly knew that this person was living comfortably in the world, Yi Wan was still unable to accept this reality. A rebel who tried to assassinate the previous emperor was actually able to live a peaceful life in the Qing kingdom. This absurd reality made it difficult for Yi Wan to suppress the anger in his heart. However, he knew that now was not the time to flare up. He still couldn't resist slowly saying in an icy voice, "Sir Fan Jr. in front of the Emperor, it is best to abide by your duty as an official." Fan Xian turned his head and smiled. He didn't say anything. He knew Yi Wan's personality and his present position in the court. He also knew why Yi Wan had such deep enmity toward him. Duty as an official? If he had truly thought of himself as an official of the Qing kingdom, the things in the palace would not have happened in the past. It was not only Yi Wan who wanted to eat Fan Xian's flesh and sleep with his skin. Most of the loyal officials in the Qing court felt a powerful hatred toward the already disappeared Sir Fan Jr. In order to quell this hatred, the Qing court had long beaten the Fan clan into the dust. All of the Fan clan's property had been confiscated. It was not brought into the national treasury. It was handed to King Jing's manor to manage. Because the emperor's mother came from Duke Lu's manor, the duke's ally was not implicated by Fan Xian. Furthermore, most of the Fan clan had long left Jingdo. Their property had been confiscated, but it had been handed to King Jing's manor. This could shut the mouths of most of the officials, but how could it truly harm Fan Xian? Fan Xian smiled calmly, warmly and sincerely at Li Qingping and said, "It's been many years since I've seen your majesty. Although court matters are troublesome, it's best if you stay for a few more days." He completely ignored Yi Wan. This was a kind of self-restraint, coldness and confidence. Li Qingping smiled slightly and said, "That's fine. It's been a long time since I've seen Sister Chen and that pair of clowns." Fan Xian also smiled and said, "Shunning and Liang are probably practicing calligraphy with Cece right now. Your Majesty, go first. I'll come after changing." He smiled bitterly. "Nowadays I sleep every day and wake up late. I have truly neglected them." The emperor of the Qing kingdom, Li Qingping, and the famous general of the Qing army, Yi Wan, walked out of the study like two normal guests. Fan Xian did not personally accompany them. This kind of treatment and situation was truly difficult to understand. However, Li Qingping and Yi Wan maintained their silence and did not show any anger. The conversation in the study earlier had completely expressed Fan Xian's attitude. The housekeeper of the West Lake Fan Manor humbly led the way in front. The housekeeper's appearance was delicate and pretty. At first glance, one would feel a sense of closeness to him. However, there were still a few acne scars on his face. It was a bit of a pity. Washed away by the warm and peaceful smile on his face, Not many people would notice this. Walking along the quiet and beautiful stone path in the manor, Li Chengping looked at the back of the housekeeper in front of him and suddenly furrowed his brows slightly. He felt that the figure was familiar, particularly the way this person responded earlier. It had the deep style of a court. It made the Qing emperor think of an unimportant figure. Hongzhu. Li Chengping furrowed his brows slightly and called out probingly. Yes, your majesty. The Fan Manor housekeeper's body froze slightly. He immediately turned around and bowed respectfully. Li Chengping looked at him with a strange gaze. After a long time, he faintly opened his mouth and said, When Sir left Jingdo, he only asked me for you. I never understood. Unexpectedly, you were able to stay by his side the entire time. Countless thoughts surged through the emperor's heart. In the Fan Manor he didn't say much. He only waved his hand and had Hongzhu lead him to the side yard. I am the dividing line at the end of the chapter. The Qing emperor, who was patrolling incognito, did not stay by West Lake for long. After 3 days and 2 more fruitless conversations with Fan Xian, Emperor Li Qingping and Yi Wan left the Fan Manor by West Lake and headed in the direction of Suzhou. In the entire Qing court, only a few important figures at the very top knew that Fan Xian was now living in seclusion by West Lake. Xue Qing, who was still the governor of Jiangnan Road, also knew. After Li Qingping ascended to the throne, he had rotated the governors of the 7 roads under heaven. However, he had never touched Jiangnan Road. One reason was because Jiangnan Road was of utmost importance to the Qing kingdom. The other reason might be that he had the thought of using Xue Qing, a powerful figure, to check and balance Fan Xian, who was living in seclusion. Amidst the sound of horse hooves, Li Qingping's expression was calm. After a long silence, he suddenly said, When Sir took Hongzhu from the palace, I thought it was as the rumors said, that Hongzhu was the head eunuch that Sir hated the most. I couldn't bear to see him. Now I find that Hongzhu is actually one of his people. Li Qingping's brows furrowed slightly. He also changed the way he addressed Fan Xian from Sir to Sir. Presumably, the exposure of Hongzhu's identity had made the most powerful ruler in the world feel a faint sense of unease and anger. Who would have thought that he had hidden so many people in the palace? No wonder he could enter and leave the palace unhindered. Nothing in the palace could be hidden from him. In the end, even father lost to him. Yi Wan was silent to the side. He hoped that the emperor could order the court to carry out the most thorough attack against Fan Xian's faction hidden in the darkness. However, the changes in the situation these few years made Yi Wan clearly feel what kind of influence Sir Fan Jr., who was nominally living in seclusion, had on the Qing kingdom and the entire world. It was basically impossible to purge him in such a situation. Li Chengping, sitting on the green horse, suddenly sighed and said, I know what you want to say. There's no need to say it. I have studied with Sir since I was young and know what kind of person he is. Mother will not allow me to have other thoughts. He turned his head and glanced at Yi Wan. He thought to himself that in the court, there was probably only this loyal official who had the most ability to assist him. As for Sir, how could he come to assist him? He could only pray that he didn't make any more big trouble. Was there some dissatisfaction? Fortunately, Li Qingping had sat on the throne for a long time, but deep in his heart, there was still the fear, gratitude and worship from his youth toward Fan Xian. These emotions were complicated, so his gaze was also complicated. Through the green trees by the side of the road, he looked at the beautiful spring scenery in the southeast. Faintly he said, Without Sir, it would be impossible for me to sit on this chair. Other than the scholars and officials in the court, who still retained a powerful murderous intent toward Fan Xian's name, the common people under heaven did not have much anger toward Fan Xian. The things that benefited the people, the legs of the stools and the halls, all had a large hang carved into them. Life by the West Lake was very comfortable. Fan Xian had already lived a number of peaceful years. However, the peace of this spring had been disturbed by the emperor's sudden visit. His heart seemed to have left the realm of tranquility. On the morning after Li Qingping left, he began to stroll through the garden with fresh dew on his head. A pair of children had already grown up and had long begun to learn. Now they were working hard with Cici to practice calligraphy every day. Back in Danzhou, Cici had helped Fan Xian copy out a great deal of the story of the stone. Her small regular script was beautiful. Fan Xian was not worried. He only felt a bit of heartache that the children had to wake up so early. Lin Wanner walked up from behind him and took out an unlined robe to drape over his body. Be careful not to catch a cold. How long did you play mahjong last night? Fan Xian glanced at her mischievously and asked teasingly. Presently, Cici still had to be responsible for the children's studies. Other than occasionally looking at the accounts of the Hangzhou conference, Lin Wanner had nothing else to do. Thus, she threw her limited life into the limitless work of building up the city wall and enjoyed it tirelessly. The people in the family aren't good enough. After a few rounds they scattered, Lin Wanner replied with a smile. She looked like a young married woman in her 20s, but her smile was still as bright and gentle as before. Her large eyes were still untainted by the dust of the world. When the second prince comes back, let's see how he'll sort you out, Fan Xian said with a smile. Speaking of Xia, Yu Chang came yesterday with a message from father. At the time the emperor was talking to you. I was afraid that these matters were important, so I didn't disturb you. Yu Chang was the black-clothed tiger guard. He had followed the retired Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, for many years. He was the Fan clan's most trustworthy aide. Hearing these words, Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly and asked, "What is the matter with father?" "Nothing important. He just wants us to go back to Danzhou in a while. Grandmother misses you. Xia also has to rush back from Shangjing. I'm afraid he won't be able to come to Hangzhou in time," Lin Wanner replied quietly. Fan Xian said, "Then let's go back." Xia. For some reason, he sighed and smiled at Wanner. "At the beginning I thought things very well. I thought that once the third prince became emperor, Xia would be able to return to the capital. Perhaps he would become the Minister of Revenue in the future and help the third prince. However, he is now my brother. I'm afraid it will be difficult for him to appear in Jingdou for the rest of his life. Don't worry about that for now." However, Yu Chang asked on behalf of father, "How exactly are we going to handle 10 Family Village?" "Follow the plan and take it slow." Fan Xian's smile gradually faded. Calmly and solemnly he said, "Since the court already knows, then there is no need to hide it so much. The third prince's words are still as insincere as when he was young. He is clearly worried to death, yet he refuses to make things clear. Since it is so, it is not good for me to say too much. Speaking of the emperor, your attitude toward him these 2 days is truly problematic. Didn't you notice Yi Wan's dark face?" Lin Wanner said with a smile. "Although your relationship with him is not like that of a normal ruler and official, he is, after all, the emperor. At least on the surface you have to do it." Fan Xian laughed and patted Wanner's head. After a moment of silence he said seriously, "I've spent half my life to reach the point where I don't kneel to others. I can't make an exception for him." In the present world, regardless of whether it was the emperor of northern Qi or the emperor of the Qing kingdom, Fan Xian did not need to kneel in front of them. If he knelt, these two emperors would probably sink into suspicious emotions. The third prince has grown up. He should have his own thoughts. The couple walked into the depths of the bamboo forest and headed toward the white stone protrusion in the distance. As they walked, Fan Xian spoke. A complicated smile rose involuntarily to the corners of his lips. "Last year he chased old Dai out of the palace. It was all because of me that old Dai kept his life. It could be said that the third prince gave me some face. Ho Jichang has also been used by him." Fan Xian passed through the bamboo forest and stood in front of the white stone protrusion. Calmly he said, "That won't do." Although his words were simple, they revealed a glimmer of unquestionable power. Lin Wanner looked at the side of his face in a daze. She did not think that her husband's words about interfering with court politics were that unbelievable. In the years after the Qing emperor's death, the power related to Fan Xian seemed to have been completely confiscated and scattered by the court. However, those who truly understood the inside story knew that if Fan Xian wanted to, he could still use a powerful power. Although Lao Wang has retired, Ziyu is still working in the capital. I'll leave this matter to him. Haven't you never wanted to interfere with the Jingdou court? Why are you doing this time? Aren't you worried about angering the emperor? This matter involves Jichang. This is the emperor trying to anger me. As for the matters of the court, I have no right to interfere. However, if he is trying to test my bottom line step by step, I don't mind pushing my bottom line a bit further forward." Fan Xian looked at his wife and said, "I understand the third prince better than you. None of the Li children are simple." After saying this, he turned his head and looked calmly at the white stone protrusion. In reality it was a grave. Qin Pingping's grave had been set by the side of the beautiful West Lake. After the Qing emperor, there was no one else in the world who could contend with Fan Xian. Li Qingping could not either. Fan Xian's power was too vast and scattered throughout the world. Even the incomparably powerful Qing emperor had his hands and feet bound by Fan Xian and could only fight a two-person battle, much less the present Li Qingping. Fan Xian had the greatest money house in the world in his hands and the loyalty of the remaining 8 ninth-level aces of the Sword Hut. He still had countless spies and trusted aides in the palace treasury. The Ming family Xia Qifei controlled was still the largest royal merchant in the Qing kingdom. Fan Xi's business in northern Qi was still the largest supplier of palace treasury smuggling. The little princess in the northern Qi royal palace was his own daughter. Lady Ning, who had been under house arrest in the palace, had been brought to Dongyi a few years ago. Going with her was the great Wang Fei Masoasua, and the young lady of Governor Wang's family Wang Tong'er. The year before last, the great prince had returned to the capital to see the emperor. Everything was as usual. The present Dongyi belonged to the Qing kingdom in name. In reality, it was still an independent kingdom ruled by the great prince and Fan Xian. Wang Tong'er had followed Prince Heqing's manor and moved to Dongyi. Wang Zhikuan could no longer continue in the position of Yanjing governor. After Commander Yi Wan had been stabbed by the shadow and grieved over the emperor's death and the chaos in the Qing kingdom, he barely managed to maintain order in court for a while before bidding farewell and leaving. Following the retirement of these two elders, the Qing military began a process of renewal. Yi Wan formally stood on the stage in Jingdo beside the emperor's dragon robe. However, this process of renewal could not be completed in a short period of time. Other than these reasons, the most important reason Fan Xian was able to have a position equal to, or even higher than, an emperor was his past history and the powerful martial support he possessed. The people close to Fan Xian had woven a large net under the heavens, one link after another. Regardless of who wanted to harm him or harm one of the links, they would probably welcome Fan Xian's attack. Everyone knew of Fan Xian's power and ruthlessness. Presently the world was very peaceful. Fan Xian looked calmly at Qin Pingping's grave and the white jade soaked in dew. He was silent. It had been a while since he had come to see the old cripple. If the third prince had not brought back some of his past memories, perhaps he would not have come today. Presently Fan Xian lived very well. His subordinates, family and friends also lived very well. Shi Chanli and Sangwen were already married. The swordsman who had once taken a blow from Fan Xian in Baoyue brothel had disappeared. Living in this world, he seemed to be perfect and had nothing else to ask for. The more it was so, the more he felt that Qin Pingping was very lonely in the grave. Although the white jade outside completely covered up the dark shadow this old man was born with, it was unable to warm Fan Xian's heart a little. Qin Pingping's grave did not have a monument. There was only a poem carved into the stone wall beside it. On it was written, "A lone sail, a leaf in the Danzhou sky, only exists between teachers and friends. How can the country be the only family name important? Who in the universe will pity the tens of thousands of people hanging? A black rider soars into the sky for 3,000 li. A lonely garden with a head of white hair for 20 years. There is no saying that when autumn comes one's body grows old. I laugh at the heroes who are not idle." A book written by a book friend. I stole it but forgot the name of the original author. Please forgive me. I'm very sorry. Each time Fan Xian sensed his transcendence in this world and his peace after the emperor's death, he stopped to read this poem and would always think of many things from the past. In reality, the strike that truly destroyed the emperor was not the rainbow in the palace or his attack. Perhaps it was the endurance he had begun many years ago and the old cripple's betrayal in the end. It was this strike that finally caused the Qing emperor to open that ugly scar of many years. He walked down from the altar and became a mortal person. Only then did he give so many opportunities to those who came after him. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He plucked a small yellow flower beside the bamboo forest and gently placed it on the grave. He then turned and left. Life at West Lake was leisurely and free. There was nothing worth writing about. The only thing that made Fan Xian unhappy was that for the sake of the people he had to take care of, he seemed to be unable to retreat and hide. Even if he wanted to travel overseas to find the true Western continent, it seemed that it would be impossible to realize in a short period of time. After all, if he were to leave this continent, who knew how many more disturbances this continent would create? This was not narcissism, nor was it arrogance. Instead, it was the legacy of the predecessors and the encounters in this life that created this incomparably brilliant yet incomparably helpless situation. In the many years at West Lake residence, the only small incident that had occurred was probably Fan Wujiao's assassination attempt. This last remaining member of the second prince's 8 generals had endured for many years in order to avenge the second prince and his colleagues. In the end, he had even thrown himself under He Zhongwei's wing. Unexpectedly, he had still been captured by Fan Xian. The Overwatch Council did not kill this person. Instead, they followed Fan Xian's wishes and exiled him. Unexpectedly, this person had once again found an opportunity to assassinate by West Lake. Of course, Fan Xian did not die. He also did not kill him. Perhaps it was because he felt that life was too boring. Or perhaps it was because he respected this kind of stubbornness that he knew he could not do it but still did it. There were singers dancing. A clear and beautiful song echoed through West Lake Fan Garden. Fan Xian's family sat scattered in the garden, eating fruits, chatting, watching the dance and listening to the song. The older singers in Qin Garden had been allowed to marry retired subordinates of the council. The ones left in Fan Garden were still about 16 years old. They were very young and inexperienced. They preferred to stay by West Lake to play. Seeing the inexperienced dancers, Fan Xian couldn't help but sigh in his heart at the old cripple's sharp eyes. When Qin Garden left the capital, these girls were probably only 10 years old. How could Qin Pingping see that they were destined to be outstanding beauties? The singer was Sang Wen's sister. This girl, who had sung for Qin Pingping for a long time, seemed to be in a bad mood. She was only willing to stay in Fan Garden and occasionally sing songs that shocked the flowers inside the moon. In the spring of the 4th year of the Qin calendar, Teng Zijing sat in front of the street and drew a few circles. He didn't say anything. His heart was miserable. He thought to himself, what kind of appearance did the young master of the Count's manor have? As the song began, Cece, who was sitting by Fan Xian's side, spat out a mouthful of tea. Lin Wan also couldn't resist laughing as she hit Fan Xian's shoulder. She thought to herself, in the entire garden, only he could write such an absurd phrase. Teng Zijing and his family, who were sitting by the side of the gate, looked at each other, particularly Teng Zijing, whose hair was gradually turning gray. He couldn't resist stroking his walking stick, thinking that the young master was too evil. When he went to Danzhou to pick up the person, how could he not be afraid? Who would have guessed that the handsome young man would end up like this? Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and examined Teng Zijing's awkward expression. His mood was very good. His pride gave birth to some happiness. He thought to himself, you are too immature. You refuse to become an official even if you are beaten to death and only want to stay in the manor. Otherwise, if you become a provincial official and I change the name of the province to Bailing, wouldn't that be perfect for a great work to come out? The Sang family girl seemed to not feel it and continued to sing seriously. It was as if she wanted to sing a certain person's comical life from beginning to end in a sentimental tone. It was near the end of spring. On the cliff outside Danzhou, Fan Xian held Shunning's soft and tender hand. Standing on the edge of the cliff, he looked at the familiar sea in front of him. Shunning gazed at her slightly worried father and said in a clear and childish voice, "Father, you don't seem to like Aunt Sang's song. Do you want Shunning to sing one for you?" "All right, let's sing Above the Rainbow." "I taught you," Shunning said with some difficulty. "But this kind of foreign language is very difficult to learn. Uncle has searched for a long time in Dongyi and still hasn't found a teacher." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Then I won't sing." He looked at his daughter beside him and for some reason, suddenly thought of the little girl in Danzhou many years ago. He also thought of the words the emperor had said before he died. He was silent and missed his sister, who he didn't know where. "Don't always follow me." The frost-faced young lady of the Fan family was dressed as a doctor. She carried a medical box on her back and walked through a remote mountain. She looked at Li Hongqing, who looked like a vagabond, behind her and coldly said, "Wuxia has already given birth to a second child. As an uncle you don't return to the manor. Besides, don't you know what King Jing is thinking?" Li Hongqing took off the straw hat on his head and fanned himself. Looking at Fan Roro by the tree, he smiled shamelessly and said, "If you want a child, go have it yourself. I don't have the time." "How much longer are you going to follow me?" Fan Roro bit her lip and looked at him angrily. "I've already followed for 5 years. What's another 5 years?" Li Hongqing replied with a smile as he led the skinny horse that was even more tired than him. Fan Roro didn't say anything. She put down the gauze curtain under her straw hat and walked toward the mountain village where white smoke rose from the foot of the mountain. Occasionally, she thought to herself that she was used to being followed by this bastard, so she might as well follow. Fan Xian's hand held Shunning. His fingers touched a warm string of beads. Lowering his head to look, he realized it was the string of ruby beads that Haitang had given to her daughter many years ago. Seeing it, he thought of her. Fan Xian couldn't help but freeze for a moment. When will Auntie Duo come to see me again? Fan Shunning obviously had a more mature mind than her age. As soon as she saw her father's expression, she guessed what he was thinking and asked very considerately. Anyway, her two mothers were not around at this time, so no one would care. Fan Xian smiled and said, When she's tired from the grasslands she'll come to see you. Haitang had returned to the grasslands. No one knew when she would come back, but what about the northern Qi Emperor and Sea Lily? What about the girl in the palace called Hong Dauphin? Rumor had it that next year Hong Dauphin would officially be made a princess. However, the northern Qi Emperor had not had any children these years. There was some commotion in court. How exactly was the female emperor going to respond? Was she going to ask him to borrow a seed? Fan Xian would not mind this kind of sacrifice. Thinking of the scene in the sword hut and the carriage, his gaze became gentle. He said, "Shunning, do you want to go to Shangjing for a stroll? Then we'll go to the grasslands. When you're a bit older we'll go out to sea." "Sure," Shunning cried out excitedly. Fan Xian's gaze landed on the surface of the sea below the cliff. Suddenly he saw a ship heading toward the harbor. In front of the deck stood a person holding a green banner. Standing in the fierce sea wind, he looked confident and at ease. 13th Wang had come. Fan Xian's body froze slightly. His eyes were moist. Boundless gratitude rose in his heart. Since 13th Wang had returned from the north, Uncle Wu Zhu, who had been recuperating on Dong Mountain, should not be far from returning. Fan Xian truly missed that piece of black cloth. In order to hide the hot tears in his eyes in front of his daughter, Fan Xian turned his body and gazed at Danzhou on this side of the sea. He looked at the residences in the city and thought of the time he had once spent there. He then thought of his life after leaving Danzhou and couldn't help but be silent. In the distant Danzhou he saw a lot. Sister Dong was no longer selling tofu, but Brother Debao sat in front of the door and used his gaze to take advantage of the passing girls. The general store had been closed the entire time. There were no clothes hanging on the balcony facing the salty sea wind. No one shouted that it was going to rain because it was indeed not raining. Many people had left, but many people had stayed. Many things had changed, but even more things had not changed. Fan Xian sat down and held his daughter in his arms, gently rocking her. Shunning narrowed her eyes and looked at the foam on the sea and the gradually approaching ship. Suddenly she asked, "Father, just what kind of person was grandmother?" Fan Xian was startled and didn't react for a long time. In his heart, Yi Qingmei had always been an exceptionally intelligent and beautiful young girl who had walked out of a fairyland. The yellow clothing on the painting did not resemble the young Yi Qingmei. Yet, at this moment in his daughter's mouth, she was already his grandmother. She was the daughter of a little immortal who snuck off from heaven to play, Fan Xian said to his daughter. Fan Xian jokingly said to his daughter, "Later I got tired of playing and went back. I can't find her in the world anymore." Fan Shunning giggled and said, "Father, you're lying. Everyone says you're an immortal poet. If grandmother returned to heaven, why didn't you?" Fan Xian scratched his head and suddenly thought of the name the emperor had bestowed upon him many years ago. Smiling, he said, "Perhaps it's because many of my thoughts are different from hers. I am just a useless commoner. No matter what foreign land I go to, there won't be much of a difference." The sea breeze brushed against his face, dispersing the shy smile he was about to reveal. After a moment of silence, he quietly said, "My life is probably, since I am here, I will take things as they come." Father and daughter met each other's eyes and smiled. Facing the sea, the flowers bloomed in the warmth of spring. Chapter 771. Originally, I wanted to make the last chapter free, but I suddenly received a call at that time. In the end, I made a complete mistake. Not being able to make it free is my problem. More importantly, I even said that it would be free at the beginning. How embarrassing. I didn't expect that I would be so embarrassed on the last day. Everyone, please don't slap my face. Chapter 772. Please allow me to explain why the epilogue dragged on for so many days. It's not because I forgot to write it every night, but because my computer had a problem. 1 hour good but 1 day bad. For a computer idiot like me, this is one of the most frustrating things in the world. Fortunately, the problem occurred after the end. I warn everyone in advance, this epilogue perfectly fulfills my desire to be long-winded. The word count is more than 20,000, very long and boring. If you don't want to read it, you can close it at any time. Below is the main body of the epilogue. Please finish reading it at the end. Around 2006, I thought of a story. This story only had the beginning of an illegitimate child, and then I thought of the illegitimate child's father, but I didn't understand the illegitimate child's mother. At the beginning of the story, the illegitimate child's mother had a rather romantic life. When the illegitimate child was 4 years old, she died in a fire. She was a pitiful and respectable mother. But as a person from the same world, I felt injustice for the mother. I felt that this was wrong. Why should an outstanding woman suffer like that in a patriarchal society? So I changed the beginning of the story. At the very least, the mother had to have a good life first. After I finished writing Vermilion Bird, at the end of April 2007, when the flowers were really blooming, I began writing Qing Yu's Year. I started this epilogue this way not because I wanted to tell everyone that this story started with Yi Qing Mei, but because the first thing I thought about was the illegitimate child. This illegitimate child did not need to think about it. He naturally appeared and stood in front of me, ready to enter the story and act as the main character. Everything about Fan Xian and why I didn't particularly like him will be discussed later. At this time, I will first talk about the course of writing Qing Yu's Year in the past 2 years. 2 years was not a short period of time. It took up quite a lot of time in my life. For those of you who have been reading novels, you must have felt the same way. But I guess what everyone felt was that Qing Yu's Year was like a nanny who helped cook and wash clothes at home every day, and a rather beautiful one at that. Watching, chatting, and gossiping, naturally she could not reach out to do anything. However, when this little nanny broke the bowls or the washing machine and made us unhappy, we could scold her or teach her a lesson or two. Of course, most of the time we would still praise her for her neat work. I think it was because she was beautiful, just like how I liked the little nanny in Growing Pains. Spending time with everyone was the greatest use a novel could have. It was like a beautiful housekeeper. Just hanging around in front of everyone was quite good. After all, we didn't care about household chores, just like how we didn't need to care if there were any profound words in the Qing Yu Year, or if there were any reflections on life. Because there weren't any. I just wanted to write a story to pass time for everyone. After accompanying him for a long time, there would naturally be feelings. He started writing the story at the end of April 2007 and officially published it on Qidian on the 1st of May. Many things happened in the past 20 months. At this moment, I began to recall my memories. I can't forget fighting for monthly votes in the new book month because I've never been so nervous and tired in my life. Actually, now that I think about it, I didn't write much. Maybe it was just the pressure. A friend came from afar and accompanied me for a few days. Finally, I managed to save some manuscripts in the new book month. Oh my god, I saved manuscripts. What kind of abnormal achievement was this for me? The chapter of Romance of the Ages had its flaws, but I was too lazy to care. A novel might need to be logical and consistent, but I never thought that was the most important task. The most important task should be to make my friends who read the book happy, and to make my own writing happy. But to be honest, I didn't like the chapter 1 wrote. Again, I was under a lot of pressure at the time, but there were some sentences that I liked. From the first day I published the book, I told everyone that since I'm already in the novel, I should be more careful in certain aspects. In the first volume, I said that things like copying poems have always been seen as a great poison. But I always felt that if there were benefits, why wouldn't I want them? What's more, from the beginning of searching for Qingji, this hobby of mine has always been the same. The things I write are often praised or criticized as pretentious. But I don't copy poems, I don't use them to make a name for myself. I watch as my fame drifts away, but I suppress the itch in my heart, suppress the desire for vanity, suppress it to the point of vomiting blood, and wait for a few decades to bring the beautiful sentences that don't exist in this world to my grave. Isn't this what it means to be pretentious? When the poem was published, everyone's reaction was very strong. At least the monthly votes were very strong. The new book month won 3rd place and I got an extra 6,000 yuan. This was the first time I got a monthly votes prize. It felt great. It seems that there are many people who share the same hobby as me. I'm very happy. After the new book month ended, I thought it would be much more relaxing. Anyway, I never thought of fighting for monthly votes. But who knew that at the beginning of July 2007, I had to go to Beijing to receive a certain award from Vermilion Bird magazine. At that time, I didn't have the money to buy a book, so I was free for a few days. Luckily, I had some manuscripts saved up, so I managed to get through those 2 days. The beauty with the rash helped me update. Beauties are always lazy, so she refused to help me come up with chapter titles. The friend who helped me save the manuscripts also went to Beijing, but this time she didn't write a single word because she was very busy in Beijing. She even met a few new friends in Xizhou. When I came back, I felt uneasy because I didn't have any manuscripts saved up. From then until now, I didn't have any manuscripts saved up for the rest of the year. I always write as I go because this is the true lazy me. The year 2007 after July was very stable. I wrote very steadily. Occasionally, I would write 3,000 words a day for 4 to 5 days. Of course, it was normal for me to write 7 to 9,000 words a day. Anyway, everyone wasn't in a hurry and I wasn't in a hurry either. As the story progressed, I wrote more when I was in a good state and I wrote less when I was in a bad state. Still the same word, lazy. But I didn't stop updating, which was very powerful. In December, I realized something, so I started to get monthly votes. First, I didn't want to waste the good intentions of those readers who voted for me every month. Second, I found that I was diligent enough and my writing wasn't bad. I could live up to their votes. Third, the most important thing was that I found that people were actually willing to help me get monthly votes. I could really squeeze into the top few and I could really earn a bonus. Who wouldn't do such a good thing? From then on, I threw myself into this magnificent cause, and I couldn't extricate myself. There was a small interlude. On the 14th of January 2008, due to the snowstorm on the flight from Guangzhou to Yichang, I had to take 2 free flights in the air, which delayed the update. This caused the first day of the Qingyu year to stop updating. It was very painful, just like my first night. I'm going down the wrong path. Forgive me, I'm really angry. That day. On that day, I found that I was very long-winded and flowy, just like in the Qingyu year. Everyone endured it and persevered until the end. There were many more and I had endured for the past 2 years. I didn't care about this epilogue. Anyway, this chapter didn't cost money, so I just needed to say a few more words. And I hope that I won't make a mistake like the previous chapter. I really can't afford to embarrass myself again because it won't be the first time, nor will it be the second time. Back to the topic, during the Spring Festival of 2008, I went back to my hometown and took 10 days off. It just so happened that I finished the Jiangnan chapter. It was normal that I didn't write because my cousin forgot to move the television over to his new house. I officially entered the year 2008. Everything was normal and everything was not normal. Because I started to get monthly votes, there was more pressure to write. The number was still not a lot, but my brain was exhausted. Fortunately, the monthly votes made it into the top 6 and top 3, and not just once. I was very proud. It was all thanks to everyone. In the 7th month of 2008, there was an annual meeting in Shanghai. Northeast leaders were interviewed. The updates were few and scattered. It was also a tense time for Dong Mountain. The book review and comments section was boiling with resentment. That month I didn't ask for monthly votes. Was it to make up for everyone's mental trauma? But what about me? Phew. I continued to write like this. I wrote mechanically. I wrote numbly. I wrote emotionally. I wrote with emotion. 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 I wrote with grief and indignation. Finally, I wrote until the 24th and 25th of this year. Almost 2 years of time was very long. Starting from Danzhou, there were 7 chapters in total. It was a lot. Such a large story with so many characters required more than 3 million words to describe. I was very proud that I had controlled this story. The problem was that this kind of control made me tired both physically and mentally. The problem was that this kind of control exhausted me physically and mentally. I was very tired. There were countless passages in the document, and there were countless useless ones. There were countless words to remind me of certain details that I hadn't forgotten, but there were still many that I had to throw away. Previously, at the end of the document, I was reading and deleting as I did so. I was a little reluctant to delete. Even I was surprised by my diligence. My teacher had once said that a good memory was not as good as a bad pen. It was true. I had done a lot of preparation work and memorized a lot of things. Although I might not be able to use all of them, I felt that my attitude was very powerful. Just as the Qing Emperor had said on Dong Mountain, I had never been so powerful in my life. I had originally thought that at this moment, I would feel like when I finished writing the Vermilion Bird story. There would be a wave of tiredness, confusion, emptiness, and confusion from the depths of my heart. However, at the end of the Qingyu year, other than a little tiredness, there were not many other emotions. On the contrary, there was a kind of calm joy. The review of my writing journey had come to an end. However, with so many words, it seemed that it did not fully reflect my hard work and contributions. I was a bit dissatisfied, but I didn't continue. Next, I would return to the Qingyu yearbook as well as the people in the book that everyone has always remembered, as well as the feelings between these people, as well as my feelings toward them, you, and many other things. Where should I start? Let's start with the appearance of the character. I'll write about whoever comes to mind. If there are characters I don't remember, then forget it. The young patient lying in the hospital is called Fan Shen. He hasn't graduated from university yet. He says he is still a virgin, but he is about to die. Yes, this is the male lead of the Qingyu year story. As for his previous life, I didn't describe too much. Even the position of chairman of the student council that I had planned out when I first designed the story was not pointed out in the end. The male lead surname was Fan Xian, and his courtesy name was Nji. Since he had come, he should take things as they come. The last words he said in the Qingyu year were actually the purpose of this book. This is Fan Xian's life. It is completely different from his mother's life. In my opinion, the previous life cannot affect the future. In a completely new world, one needs to live from the beginning. Since it is so, there is no need to touch too much on the matters of the previous life. The attitude of this life is actually the same as the attitude you and I have in this world. Humans cannot become philosophers or natural-born revolutionaries just because they have lived two lives. They are still insignificant and lowly, you and I, and do our best to live as ordinary and peaceful as possible. I have said before that I don't really like the character of Fan Xian, at least not the Fan Xian in front of the meadow, or perhaps compared to the other characters in the book. The reason for this is actually not complicated. If we tear off the clothes on Fan Xian's body and strip away the golden light brought by the transmigration of mother and son, the naked him is just a naked you and a naked me. Greedy for life, afraid of death, fond of ease, fond of leisure, fond of enjoyment, has a moral outlook formed after education, but when it comes to carrying it out, it is very vulgar, ambiguous, vain, used to pretending, fond of beauty, but unable to let go of his status, insisting that he is still a white-clothed CJ youth who believes in love. He wants to follow his brother's love, but he also doesn't want to lose his sister-in-law's love. He wants to take care of one without losing the other. In the end, he finds that he can't change anything, not even himself. He can only act according to the established guidelines and walk down a certain path. It can be said that this is moderate, gentle, and ordinary. On the Dragon Sky Forum, a forum member once said the words hometown wish. I think it is true. Hometown wish is the thief of virtue. However, the vast majority of people, including you and me, are like this, especially those of us who appear on the internet. Of course, if you are not the type of person I am referring to, please forgive me for being extreme. I don't like the attitude that I may sometimes display, it is not direct enough. I am too familiar with this kind of person. The people around me, including a certain part of myself, are actually very similar to Fan Xian, so I am unable to like Fan Xian too much. In the story of Qing Yu's year, there were also a few idealists. In front of these idealists, no matter how beautiful Fan Xian was, no matter how he alternated between white and black, spat out poems, spat out a mouthful of blood, was supported by a servant girl to see the begonia flowers, and then flew in the wind to confidently fight the world, there was always a problem with his heart, and the light was slightly dim. I myself cannot be an idealist. I also feel that there is no major problem with Fan Xian's attitude towards life. In fact, it is the best attitude towards the people and things around him. However, I still respect idealists because I cannot do it myself, so it is difficult for me to respect Fan Xian. Fan Xian is only you and me. Just like the me who wrote this story and the you who read this story, if there really came a day when you were struck by lightning and transmigrated, if you had Fan Xian's good luck, the blessings of the predecessors, and the beautiful body, perhaps you would be another Fan Xian. Fortunately, Fan Xian improved in the end, which is gratifying. It is just that I wrote it rather stiffly. Such a story cannot give me too much time and the possibility of too many words to describe the true growth of the middle-aged Fan Xian. Speaking of this, I suddenly thought, Fan Xian really does look like a handsome middle-aged professor who has lost his hot-bloodedness a long time ago. I know a professor who is not bad when it comes to love. Whether or not Fan Xian's view of the world is correct does not need to be discussed, because he is not a saint who looks 500 years ahead and 500 years behind. But at least he has a relatively firm view of something, and that is not bad. It was not until the cave in Shi Mountain, in front of the dying Shaoan, that Fan Xian truly confirmed his sense of belonging to this world. This is something that Gidge Pig once mentioned, and I deeply agree with it. Fan Xian is not an indecisive person, but he wants to take care of everyone too much. It is like the feeling of smoothing things over. I mentioned this a little bit before, but I will not go into it here. His most admirable strength is probably his diligence, his hard work to survive, and his spirit of seeking a better life. This is probably the most common strength, but it is also the strength that is most worthy of applause. As for Fan Xian's love life, it is really a mess. This is mainly my fault because I was the one who wrote him. Based on my understanding of men who are creatures with the lower half of their bodies, once they are reincarnated into a society like the Kingdom of Qin, especially with Fan Xian's background, it is only logical that he would have a maid at 12, a maid at 13, and a maid at 14. Then he would go around the world, poor and virtuous, rich and have a large number of wives and concubines. It may not sound good to female readers, but it is true. A nicer phrase would be nothing more than saving the world's pitiful orphan girls, lingering around, spoiling others, constantly searching for a partner on the road of revolution, a partner whose outlook on life and the world can keep up with his footsteps. So it is my fault. I clearly know that I love beautiful women, but I still believe in this thing called love. So I arranged for Fan Xian to enter the temple of Qing and see his fiancée nibbling on a drumstick. I wrote it very happily. How could I let go of a woman like Lin Wanner? How could I not be moved by this kind of love story? I thought of Zhang Mingming's song. It is my fault again. I also like the new and never get tired of the old. In an evil society where men are allowed to have a few women, I can't help but let Fan Xian meet a different kind of woman, a woman who revisits the past, and every one of them is very happy, because things that cannot be done in reality are put into novels. This is the true meaning of fantasy, and I am no exception. Either it is more straightforward, like that old hoodlum Duan Jingchun, or it is to see men as a gelding, proudly standing among the grassland horses, only lowering his head to rub against the ones beside him. Fan Xian wants both. As the saying goes, in the later years of a hoodlum, he will also shed tears when reading love letters. Fan Xian's attitude towards love is slightly better than Zhang Wuji's, and much better than a man with 3 bad habits. He probably won't hate me too much. Let's talk about Fan Xian's feelings towards men. Please note there is no gay burning factor here, just a few words. From the wedge, it can be clearly seen that he is a person without parents, so he has some hidden Oedipus complex. So even if Yi Qingmei is not much older than him, even if the emperor does not seem to be a good father, even if Fan Jian has nothing to do with him, even if Qin Pingping can never have a son, even if Wu Zhu is about the same age as Qin Pingping, but as he tosses and turns, Fan Xian's feelings towards these men have finally been born. Because we are all very practical people, if someone is good to you, you will naturally be good to them, remember they're good, and thus develop feelings. Of the men mentioned above, apart from the really ugly teacher Fei Ti, they all treated Fan Xian very well. Some people might say what the Qing emperor did to the newly born Xian Xian and so on. Thinking about it from a different perspective, the feelings between men need time to develop. The Qing emperor had once told Fan Xian in the little building that when Fan Xian was in Danzhou, the Qing emperor often heard news of him, either through Qin Pingping or Fan Jian. A person like Fan Xian who knows how to pretend to smile shyly, is easy to like. After seeing more, hearing more, and knowing more, he will develop feelings. Perhaps one could make a horizontal comparison. Everyone would find that the Qing emperor's trust and love for Fan Xian was truly not something his sons could compare to. For one, it was because Fan Xian really knew how to pretend. From before the Hanging Temple, he had truly tricked the great emperor. For another, it was probably because the Qing emperor felt guilty and had thoughts of shifting his affection, so the Qing emperor treated Fan Xian very well. Naturally, this was for the Qing emperor, who was an evil gathering of royal power. It was not to be compared to a normal father. Fan Xian's feelings for Yi Qingmei were rather complicated. This was not clear. The book said a lot of superficial things, so I won't go into specifics. What else was there to say about Fan Xian? It seemed that there was none. All right, about his abilities. His abilities are actually quite good. After all, he is the male lead. Wu Zhu, the cute bamboo doll, the cold bamboo commander, the forever black-masked youth, and the rainbow in his heart that no one knows about. There is nothing much to say about Wu Zhu because I like him very much. If I praise Wu Zhu too much, I will go to hell. If I cover my face and say, the reason Wu Zhu is called Wu Zhu is because of the pronunciation of Yuzu. If you know, then you know. If you don't know, then let the shameless me go. I just want to talk about the matter of Wu Zhu and Yi Qingmei. The rainbow in his heart, enshrouded in thousands of years of ice and snow, burst forth from the little girl who to this day had appeared in the temple for some unknown reason. Yi Qingmei had allowed a fresh soul to be born into this world. What was Wu Zhu's feeling toward Yi Qingmei? To borrow from the comment of a great book friend, it was, without question, Wu Zhu has the least affection for Xiao Yezi. To her, he only has cold metal promises. However, Wu Zhu also has the most affection for Xiao Yezi. She is his world. Alright, Wu Zhu stopped here because he had never said much. Presently, he was on Dong Mountain recovering from his injuries. He didn't know if the materials 13th Wang went to the temple to steal would be enough for him to live for another 500 years. Qin Pingping was the third character to appear in the wedge. From then on, everyone should know his importance. This eunuch Qin Wuchang who liked to stick a fake beard under his chin, this cripple who had been in a wheelchair for half his life, this skinny old man who was afraid of the cold and liked to cover his knees with wool blankets, and this director of the Overwatch Council who liked to cover the windows of his Overwatch Council room with a piece of black cloth. I couldn't say much about Qin Pingping because I also liked him. Of the male characters in the book, I liked him and Wu Zhu the most because they were very manly. My heart yearned for them. Qin Pingping's name should have been changed later by Yi Qingmei. In reality it was printed with Qin Pingping, the awesome person. When I read the records of the Grand Historian, I felt that Qin Pingping was too awesome. What? No one knew exactly why he was so awesome. Even Tai Shigong didn't know and couldn't say for sure. There was a time when Qin Pingping, who liked to joke around, was also very awesome. There was no need to mention his past achievements. I liked the image of this old cripple the most. He was a little yellow flower, a wheelchair, and a pure heart under the skin of an old orange. Qin Pingping was an idealist. Although his ideals were a bit vague, there was a good saying that it was not difficult to do one good deed. What was difficult was to do good deeds for a lifetime. It was not difficult for Qin Pingping to make a conspiracy. What was difficult was to make a conspiracy for a lifetime and still live for the brightest thing in his heart. What was it that shone in Qin Pingping's heart? It was not the conflict of ideas, nor was it the peace and happiness of the common people. It was definitely not the prosperity of the Qing dynasty. It was the promise of the past. He remembered someone's good deeds. He was more disdainful of being a slave than Fan Xian, a modern man. He firmly guarded that woman's shining ideals. Guarding someone else's ideals for a lifetime was idealism. I didn't have any regrets about the description of Qin Pingping in the book because it was written with great care. It had reached the limit of my ability. I felt that I had not let Qin Pingping down. From the beginning I had set up his ending. I didn't have any sudden thoughts. I only respected him and fulfilled his wishes. The two guns in the black wheelchair were because I had seen a movie called Lone Wolf when I was young. The wheelchair in the movie had left a deep impression on me. I had to give it to Sister Pingping to use. As for his final words before he died, I had thought of them at the beginning of the story. I guarded those words for a whole year. I wanted to tell everyone that this eunuch, this damned eunuch, also had a gun. In reality he had more guts than most men. At the end of the chapter, I could even shamelessly explain and explain again and again. Please understand me. I truly wanted everyone to feel my feelings. I hoped that Qin Pingping could still collect long-horned, long-tailed beauties in hell. Of course he could not go to heaven. I spoke of whoever I thought of. That is why I am talking about the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian. I have many apologies for him. Because there was too little space, I did not write clearly about his feelings and thoughts. However, compared to Prime Minister Lin Ruofu who guarded Wuzhou, he was more open-minded. The man who stayed in the brothel was actually closer to the role of an official than Qin Pingping. Thus, he was actually very pained. In the end, he could only float away and resign. He probably had hopes for the Qing kingdom, but he could only passively watch all of this happen. Because of Fan Xian, he had to do something he actually did not want to do. Did Fan Jian have any feelings for Yi Qingmei? Who knows? At least I don't know. At the time, I didn't write it, so I didn't think about it. To say there were no feelings would be a lie. As for whether it was between a man and a woman or between brother and sister, I still didn't think about it. However, the Fan clan helped Yi Qingmei preserve the only bloodline in this world and indirectly caused Fan Xian's arrival. This already explains a lot. Fan Xian's future generations will all have the surname Fan. Making the Fan family of Danzhou famous can be considered a small compensation. However, I have thought about Minister Fan's attitude toward Fan Xian. In reality, Fan Jian had always thought that if the emperor wanted his son back, he would probably force Ruoruo to marry Fan Xian. Don't forget, when Ruoruo was still very young and her health was very poor, this Count Sinan had sent his only daughter back to Danzhou. Later, he had secretly maintained the correspondence between Danzhou and Jingdou. Why was this? Unfortunately, in the end, Fan Xian returned to the Fan clan's ancestral hall. While Minister Fan was gratified, would he also feel a little disappointed? I always thought that many middle-aged men might have some kind of fantasy. They would have their own son or daughter marry another woman's son or daughter in order to satisfy their unfulfilled desires. Truly, many people would fantasize about forming this kind of relationship with their first love. Of course, there are also friends who would directly direct their strategic gazes toward the children of their first love. This is something I admire. Speaking of this, I suddenly thought of Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongqing, so I mentioned Li Hongqing. As for the Crown Prince, I liked him very much. It seemed that I liked all the people who appeared in the epilogue so far. Was this not too unfair to Fan Xian? Perhaps it was because I felt that Fan Xian was like my son, so I habitually imitated Wu Zhu and used a stick to educate him? The reason I like Li Hongqing was very simple. Back then, he and the second prince traveled together, but it was only for the sake of friendship. He was a bit naive, but he was bright enough. In the Li royal family, only the eldest prince and Hongqing might have slightly broken away from the natural gloominess of the royal family. Hongqing's bright and lively aura was even more brilliant. In the book review section there was a post that talked about this and I liked it very much. Li Hongqing went after Miss Fan. This kind of shameless dog spirit is worth most of us men to learn from. As for the friends who hoped that Miss Fan and her brother would be together, they could all imagine the female doctors after the age of 30. In any case, this was an open ending, an ending that did not offend anyone. This also proved what I said earlier. I really was that kind of person. The Crown Prince, the second prince, and the Great Prince did not say too much because the first two in the book had already dissected it before they died. There was nothing to say here. I just felt some sympathy for Li Qingqian. His luck was too bad. His fate was not good. His father was too strange. His father always thought that everyone in the world was like a cockroach like him. As for the second prince, it was just as he said. He worked hard to the end and found that he had become the biggest joke. What an absurd reality this was. In the world of the Qing kingdom, there were no real precious jade or fake precious jade. There were only two young people who were very similar. Because the paths of their lives were different, they gave birth to completely different fruits. The great prince wished that he would be filial to Lady Ning and Dongyi and unite well with the great princess, Wang Tong'er, and Ma Suosua. These three were not simple women. He wished that he could be like he was on the Western Hu grasslands, undefeated in every battle. Of course, I thought this was an extravagant hope. This person, who had given Fan Xian the most crucial support at the most critical moment, could not hope that Fan Xian would continue to help him with family matters in the future. I had to talk about Yan Bingyun. I could only say, it was hard to say. This person was hard to say, so I had nothing to say. White-robed young master, who did he work hard for? It was fine as long as the girls continued to look at him. I truly had nothing to say. Wang Qinian could say something. He was very good at talking. The cold-faced clown's skill was not fully displayed because there was indeed not enough space. This story of over 3 million words seemed long, but there were too many people and things in it. However, as Fan Xian's most trusted person, the first leader of the Qinian unit, and the best supporting character in the world, he already had glory. Don't forget the keys, chests, and many secrets that no one in the world, including the Qing Emperor Qin Pingping, knew. While he couldn't sleep in the middle of the night, did he also feel excited? It was as if he had returned to the days when he was a great bandit at the border of the three countries. The name Wang Qinian was the ID of flying general. He had aimed at it a few years ago on the illusory sword and felt it was very good. When he wrote this story he used it. As for the three great grandmasters, it was truly impossible to say. Just as the Qing Emperor had said, they were monsters that should not exist in this world. With such monsters above all living things had to look up to them. Their necks would easily get sore, and the incidence of cervical spondylosis would decrease. However, the benefits were not obvious. If Ku He was not called Zhan Mingyue and was the great-uncle of the northern Qi royal family, if Dongyi was not Sigu Jian, and if Yi Luyun was not raised to be such a mischievous person, how much trouble would these three great grandmasters have caused? Standing above all living things, they probably wouldn't care about the lives and deaths of all living things. Fortunately, they had their identities and restraints. Thus they became three nuclear warheads. No one dared to throw them out first until the electromagnetic weapon the Qing Emperor had hidden for a long time suddenly moved on Dong Mountain. It directly injured Ku He and Sigu Jian's hearts full of confusion and made them unable to move again. Comparatively speaking, I like Sigu Jian more. The reason is simple. I've written more about him. The longer I've known him, the more I feel for him. However, it seems that Fan Xian is an exception. God, I'm so sorry. I'm starting to talk about him again. Other than 13th Wang, who else does a man need to talk about? It seems that there isn't because I am also sleepy. My mind is truly empty. What should I talk about 13th? In any case, he already has Yi Ling so I won't disturb him. Brother Valiant General is not as pretty as Lin Qingxia, and he doesn't have Zhou Xingxing to interrupt him. It's inevitable that he is lonely and bored. Fortunately, he has Yi Ling. I repeat, men and women are strange and wonderful things. Snapping my fingers, I thought of Brother Shadow. However, Brother Shadow is a shadow. He is floating behind us, coldly and expressionless as he looks at your computer screens. After talking about men, let's talk about women. First, I will talk about Fan Xian's women. They may not be his women, but in my position they are all his women. Everyone says there isn't enough drama, but women come. I put my hands together and smiled as I thought, I've endured it. I've truly endured it. There aren't many female characters in the year of the Qing dynasty who can truly leave a deep impression. This is something that can't be helped. War, revenge, and conspiracies will make women walk away. Only those women who don't need to walk away will continue to appear in front of us. Returning to the main topic, I will first talk about Lin Wan. Yes, Fan Xian's official wife, the illegitimate daughter of the eldest princess and Prime Minister Lin, the niece that the Qing emperor dotes on dearly. Her nickname is Yi Chen, and her cheeks have baby fat. Yes, I wrote based on Lin Yi Chen. When I began writing the year of the Qing dynasty, I was madly in love with her, just like when I began writing the Vermilion Bird, I was madly in love with Zhang Liangying. Please don't use this to criticize me. I always thought that for a middle-aged man to have such a strong interest in variety entertainment and to be able to like one young woman after another on television proved that this middle-aged man was a very good fellow. For example, the narcissistic me. I also liked the character of Lin Wan, because I liked her, I cared. Thus, the meeting in the Qing temple and the plot to enter the room were all carefully thought out and written. Even the cumin wind by the lakeside was still something I liked. If I was allowed, I was even willing to write the year of the Qing dynasty into a romance novel. In reality, I really did want to write a romance novel like the one Shi and Yu Qing wrote. However, the subscriptions were slipping, the monthly votes were being chased, and the book review section was crying boredom. Big Brother was watching me and money was tempting me. Thus, Lin Wanner's appearances became fewer and fewer, and her sense of existence became weaker and weaker. In the story of the year of the Qing dynasty, she lived miserably in the cracks and passively accepted everything that was placed on her. This was a very sad thing, but no one could change any of this. I won't hide it from everyone. When I wrote about Jiangnan and Jinghua, I had tried hard for Lin Wanner's sense of existence, but I still failed. There was nothing I could do. At that time I was truly a bit unhappy. Thus I complained to the leader who thought I was sucking up to her. I said these words at this time because I truly felt sorry for Lin Wanner, so I bowed in apology. Chapter 773. The theme has been decided, and the name has been decided. It's still the same vulgar and cheap name, Spy. It's hard to say the specific content because I don't even know what category it is. But it's definitely not a rebirth, and it's definitely going to be something extremely old-fashioned. It's still the same, I only know how to write such things. The release date of the new book is set to be around the 27th of April. It's my fault for making everyone wait for so long. I originally wanted to start writing it on the 1st of April, but I still had something to do. I still had something to do on the 10th, and even today I still have something to do. Furthermore, it's all family matters, so I'm very sorry. Vermilion Bird has ended, and I've spent a long time in between. At that time I said that I saw a life and death contract, a wedding, and the birth of a child. It was very stimulating. Now that 2 years have passed, I realize that life is still the same. I'm not pretending to be a petty bourgeoisie like many people say. It's really a midlife crisis and I need to hurry and earn money. Although I said I'm in a hurry to earn money, I still dragged it out for so long. What a lazy cat, but it's definitely a serious cat. So it seems that the matter of stockpiling manuscripts has nothing to do with me. On the 27th, my fingers started to type. I hope that everyone who has been waiting for so long will give me enough face and call out to me softly. I can't guarantee that the new book, Spy, will be good, but I can guarantee that I will try my best to write it well and seriously. I have confidence in it, and everyone has confidence in me too because we're all narcissistic. Chapter 774. The faultless chapters of Qing Yunyan will continue to be updated on Qingdao Novel website. There will be no advertisements on the website, so please collect and recommend it to Qingdao Novel website. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.